Thank you for downloading the book in the free electronic library royalib.ru, http://royalib.ru. All books by the author, http://royalib.ru/author/Akhmetov_Oleg.html. The same book in other formats, http://royalib.ru/book/Armetov_Oleg/Sami_K_Kos_Mosu_AUL.html. Enjoy reading. I think it's worth a little bit of history first. There will be a cosmodrome here, the guy in Panama said. And with an axe he hammered a stake into the planet. Ivan Miroshnikov. As one of the veterans of the space harbor said, if only the first artificial Earth satellite and the Vostok spacecraft with the first cosmonaut on board, Yuri Gagarin, were launched from the Baikonur Cosmodrome, then these two events would be more than enough to make Baikonur enter the history of mankind as the greatest achievement of the 20th century. The official birthday of Space Harbor is June 2, 1955. Meanwhile, the history of the world's largest cosmodrome began 6 months earlier, on a frosty winter evening on January 12, 1955, when the first platoon of military builders who arrived from the neighboring city of Aralsk landed at the small Tyuratam railway junction. As one of the participants in the construction landing recalled, the first impressions of the new duty station were very unenviable. It was dark, cold, and dogs were barking. The first builders of the cosmodrome were sheltered by the inhabitants of several houses of the Tyuratam junction. But the Tyuratams themselves did not lose out. The builders taught the local children to play volleyball and basketball, games that were unknown until then in the station village of the desert part of the Kyzyloda region. And over time, they got the opportunity to watch movies that were played for the soldiers on an impromptu screen built from an ordinary sheet. I must say that they chose a place for the construction of the future cosmodrome very scrupulously. Several possible options were considered at once, including the construction of a cosmodrome in the Krasnoyarsk territory or in the North Caucasus. At the same time, 5 factors were taken into account at once: the presence of a large uninhabited territory, proximity to the equator, to large water and railway lines, suitable weather conditions. At that time there were at least 300 sunny days a year in these places. All these requirements were met by the Tyuratam junction area in the Kyzyloda region of Kazakhstan. A week later, after the landing of the first builders of the future cosmodrome, endless echelons with equipment and labor began to arrive at the Tyuratam station. And already in June 1955, the construction of Object 135 began, the first launch complex, which later became known to the whole world as the Gagarin Start. There were many rumors that the world's first spaceport was built by prisoners. But this is absolute nonsense. The secrecy of the construction was such that it was entrusted exclusively to the military. By the way, the construction of the Century cost the Soviet Union very inexpensively. Military builders worked solely for the idea. For comparison, if the first time the Gagarin Start was built for relatively little money, then its restoration after a rocket explosion in September 1983 cost a pretty penny. Within 8 months, highly qualified specialists revived the main launch complex of Baikonur. They worked tirelessly, in 3 shifts. And the Soviet government did not skimp on the costs. Almost each of the builders who worked on the restoration of Site No. 1 received from 1,500 to 2,000 full-weight Soviet rubles a month. Let me remind you. Simultaneously with the first launch, a residential town for the pioneers of the space harbor was also being built. On May 5, 1955, the first stone of the first building of the future administrative center of the cosmodrome was laid at Baikonur. It should be noted that today this stone is located several hundred meters from the historical place where it was laid. The first stone of the city interfered with the laying of the road. By the way, all the first houses were wooden. And until now, the area of the city, from which the settlement of the first builders of the space harbor began, is called the Wooden Town by Baikonur residents. The construction of the world's first cosmodrome was supervised by a rather experienced builder, General Georgy Maximovich Shubnikov, who went through the entire war building river crossings and other engineering structures. And after the victory, he became famous all over the world when the builders under his command created the famous Treptow Park Memorial Complex in Berlin. It is quite clear that the construction of the cosmodrome was carried out in an atmosphere of the strictest secrecy. And in order to hide the true location of the construction, the future cosmodrome was named the same as a small village in the Tsezkazgan region, Baikonur. And this name of the cosmodrome, which became known to the whole world, has survived to this day. True, few people know that Baikonur owes its name to ballistic specialists. When the first man on Earth flew into space, it was necessary to announce where the launch was from, and how to report if the landfill number 5 is the main secret of the USSR. This is where ballistics came to the rescue. They drew a perpendicular to the Earth from the place where the first stage of the rocket separated. The line ended up in the village of Baikonur. Since then, this name has been given to the first cosmodrome of the planet. By the way, in order to mislead the American intelligence services. But the administrative center of the cosmodrome was much less fortunate. Its name has changed several times: Moscow, 400, Tashkent, 90, Kyzyloda, 50, the village of Zaria, the village of Leninsky, the city of Leninsk. And finally, the city of Baikonur. After the first launch complex and the assembly and test building were built in a fantastically short period of 1.5 years, in which the assembly and technological tests of the R-7 rocket were carried out, on May 15, 1957 from Site Number 1, as the Launch Secret Service designated the future, Gagarin launch, carried out the first launch of the R-7 rocket designed by Sergei Pavlovich Korolev. Until now, the modernized Royal 7 is known as the Soyuz U launch vehicle, which launches manned spacecraft, cargo, Progress, and many other spacecraft into space. But the famous launch vehicle began to fly reliably far from immediately. The very first launch of the R-7 in 1957 ended with a rocket crash at 109 seconds of flight. The second and third launches were also unsuccessful. On June 9, the launch did not take place at all. 3 attempts to start the engines were unsuccessful due to a factory defect, and the rocket was sent back to the manufacturer. And on July 12, the rocket exploded again on the active leg of the flight. Each failure was naturally scrupulously analyzed by specialists led by the chief designer himself, Sergei Pavlovich Korolev. Numerous amendments were made, improvements were made, and again at the start. As experts say, the rocket was taught to fly. And taught. The fourth launch of the R-7 rocket under the symbol L1-8 took place on August 21, 1957 at 18:15. This time, the launch vehicle worked steadily. The separation of the head of the rocket took place strictly according to the schedule. However, the warhead itself in the planned fall area 6,000 kilometers from Baikonur, having entered the atmosphere, collapsed from high thermal and mechanical overloads. And only a week later, after fragments of the warhead were found on Earth, information about the successful launch was made public in a TASS message. But before the launch of the first artificial Earth satellite, they decided to test the rocket again. On September 7, another successful launch of the R-7 launch vehicle took place. After that, preparations began for the launch of the first satellite. And then came the evening of October 4, 1957. 22 hours 28 minutes Moscow time. And according to local, Kazakhstani time, it was already October 5. A modified R-7 rocket called Sputnik launched into the starry sky. Already 10 minutes after the launch, the satellite sent its famous beep beep from a height of 228 kilometers above our planet. The first artificial satellite of our planet was a small metal ball with a diameter of 58 centimeters and a weight of 83 kilograms 600 grams, on which 4 antennas and 2 transmitters with a wavelength of 7.5 and 15 meters were installed. It made a complete revolution around the Earth in 96 minutes. In total, the first satellite stayed in space for 92 days, flying around the Earth 1,400 times during this time. After that, the satellite burned up in the dense layers of the atmosphere. Thus began the space age of mankind. And it continued very actively. A month later, on November 3, the second artificial satellite with the dog Laika on board was launched into low Earth orbit, and on May 15, 1958, the third man-made satellite rose above the Earth. It was too late to walk on the moon, but what moon rovers they created! The first flights of spacecraft made it possible to study other planets in detail. It is quite clear that the first object of attention of scientists was the celestial body closest to the Earth, the Moon. Therefore, after the launch of the first satellites at the Korolev Design Bureau and at Baikonur, large-scale work began to prepare a flight to the Moon. For this purpose, an improved 3-stage launch vehicle was created on the basis of the R-7 rocket. The first launch of this rocket took place on September 23, 1958, which, like many first launches, was very unsuccessful and brought many unpleasant minutes to the entire combat crew. at the 92nd second of the flight, the rocket, having lost one of the side engines, began to write out unpredictable pirouettes over the launch. In the end, it collapsed not far from the launch site, seriously damaging the building of the assembly and test building where this rocket was assembled. Luckily, no one died then. The next two launches were also emergency. On October 12, the rocket exploded 100 seconds after launch, and on December 4, at the 245th second of the flight, the engine failed and fell again. It can be said that the situation with the first flight tests of the R-7 rocket was repeated. A successful launch turned out only on the fourth attempt. Only on January 2, 1959, the Lunar 1 spacecraft, which in fact became the first interplanetary station, practically reached our natural satellite, flying past the Moon at a distance of 6,000 kilometers. And already the Lunar 2 apparatus, which launched on September 12, 1959, hit the surface of the Moon and, as stated in the TASS report, delivered the pennant of the USSR to our celestial neighbor. In fact, Lunar 2 crashed during the lunar landing because it did not have soft landing engines. Nevertheless, the achievements of Soviet cosmonautics were appreciated even by foreign businessmen. A French champagne producer announced that the first person to photograph the far side of the Moon was rewarded with a box of collectible champagne. After the Lunar 3 spacecraft, which went into space exactly 2 years after the start of the space age, October 4, 1959, flew around our closest space neighbor and transmitted to Earth images of the invisible side of the Moon, a box of champagne was handed over to Sergei Pavlovich Queen. By the way, in Baikonur, in the Museum House of the Queen, guides still show visitors several empty bottles from under that famous box, and the champagne itself was immediately drunk by the conquerors of space. In the meantime, in the mid-60s, the Soviet Union developed a program for a manned flight to the Moon, under which several spacecraft were created at the Korolev Design Bureau at once, which received the L-1, L-3 indices. For these ships, the separate design bureau of Sergei Pavlovich Korolev developed a fundamentally new rocket carrier N-1, which could deliver a spacecraft to the Moon and back. Unfortunately, work on the new N-1 launch vehicle was not very successful. The rocket stubbornly refused to fly. And the main problem of this rocket was the low reliability of the complex power plant of the first stage, which consisted of 32 engines. The designers could not achieve a clear synchronization in their work. As a result, all 4 launches of the N-1 rocket ended in explosions and falls. And the N-1 launch vehicle program was closed. Although N-1 could become a new stage in the development of astronautics. And the problem of synchronizing the operation of engines could well be solved by ordinary onboard computers, which, unfortunately, did not exist at that time. In the meantime, the Americans were also strenuously boosting their lunar program. The Soviet Union had to catch up with its main rival in the space race. For this reason, in 1967, it was decided to carry out a manned flight around the Moon by launching the L-1 spacecraft with the Proton rocket carrier, for which 2 launches were built at the 81st site of the Baikonur Cosmodrome back in 1965. And by 1967, the Proton was already actively used in the implementation of space programs. The 8K-82K product, created at the Design Bureau of academician Vladimir Nikolaevich Kelemy, began its flight biography with a successful launch on July 16, 1965. On that day, from the Baikonur Cosmodrome, the Proton automatic station was launched into near-Earth orbit, which gave the name to the new launch vehicle. It was the Proton that began to be used when launching interplanetary stations to our nearest celestial neighbor in 1969. But, after the American landing on the Moon and the successful return of the Apollo crew to Earth in July 1969, it became clear that the Soviet Union lost the lunar race under the manned program. Then in the USSR it was decided to switch to the study of our nearest space neighbor with the help of automatic lunar stations. Launched by Proton on September 12, 1970, the Lunar 16 station safely reached the night luminary and a week later made a soft landing in the area of the Sea of Plenty. The next major step in the exploration of near space was the landing on the Moon of the Lunar-1 self-propelled vehicle, which was controlled by commands from the Earth. Our lunar tractor, as Vladimir Vysotsky called the Lunar Rover in his song, for 10 months of work passed 10,540 meters along the Sea of Rains. And Lunar 2 worked in 1973 on the surface of the Moon for 5 whole months, having traveled a path of 37 kilometers. In 10 months of work he passed 10,540 meters along the Sea of Rains. And Lunar 2 worked in 1973 on the surface of the Moon for 5 whole months, having traveled a path of 37 kilometers. In 10 months of work he passed 10,540 meters along the Sea of Rains. And Lunar 2 worked in 1973 on the surface of the Moon for 5 whole months, having traveled a path of 37 kilometers. Many years have passed since then, when becoming a historical milestone. From the boundless steppe of Baikonur to the whole world it sounded, "Let's go." At the end of 1959, Sergei Pavlovich Korolev began to prepare for the implementation of a grandiose project, the flight into space of the first man on Earth. The development of satellite ships before a human flight was carried out by launching them with animals and mannequins. The first of 5 experimental flights of the Vostok prototype took place on May 15, 1960. And again there was a lot of excitement. 2 out of 5 test launches were unsuccessful. The first of the launched ships did not land due to a failure of the Earth orientation system, and the third one burned up in the dense layers of the atmosphere due to an off-design trajectory. Despite this, already on the 4th test ship, a spacecraft with a mannequin imitating a person rose into a near-Earth orbit at a height of 320 kilometers. All the necessary equipment for future human flight was placed in this ship. The mannequin, the first to fly into space, was immediately dubbed Ivan Ivanich by the specialists of the Cosmodrome. And Ivan Ivanovich spent the next flight already in the company of 2 dogs, the famous Belka and Strelka. By the way, there is a rather interesting story about this flight at Baikonur. Veterans say that on the eve of the launch, one of the dogs prepared for the flight simply ran away. And so, in order to avoid serious punishment, after all, the dogs were trained for flight for more than 1 month. Specialists caught a similar mongrel in the Baikonur steppe and sent it into space. After the 4-legged astronauts successfully flew into orbit on August 19, 1960 and returned to Earth, a joke was born at the Cosmodrome that any Baikonur dog is a potential astronaut. Of course, after the successful launches of the first satellites, it became clear to many Soviet people that manned spaceflight was not far off. And hundreds of applications from volunteers went to various authorities, asking them to be the first to be sent on the spacecraft. Then no one knew that a group of fighter pilots had already been selected, which in March 1960 began to prepare for flight into space. Gagarin, Titov, Bykovsky, Nikolaev, Nelyub and Popovich were trained in the first group. And at Baikonur, the development of the spacecraft continued, on which the first cosmonaut of the planet was to launch. In March 1961, 2 more test launches of a spacecraft with a dummy and experimental animals were carried out. On March 9, the dog Chernushka went into space, and on March 25, the dog named Dimka. By the way, Dimka, at the personal request of Yuri Gagarin, was renamed Zvezdoka. And with this nickname, she flew into space. After the successful completion of the tests, the first 6 cosmonauts arrived at Baikonur on April 5, 1961. The cosmonauts immediately began practical training. And the testers at that time were preparing the launch vehicle, the spacecraft, and all ground equipment for launch. And the State Commission sat continuously. On April 8, at a special closed meeting in a summer pavilion on the banks of the Syr Doria, the Commission finally decided who was the first of the Earthlings to go into space. The candidate for the role of the first cosmonaut of the planet was Yuri Gagarin, his understudy was German Titov. And the gazebo itself, in which the Commission met, became famous and was called Gagarinskaya. Another interesting fact. On the eve of the launch of the first man into space on April 9, Sergei Pavlovich Korolev decided to show future cosmonauts how the R-9A combat rocket was launched. But at 8 o'clock in the morning, the rocket exploded during launch in front of the astronauts. Korolev hastened to reassure Yuri Gagarin that the R-7 rocket, on which the first cosmonaut would fly, was much more reliable. And then the morning of April 12, 1961 came. At 6:30, the bus with the astronauts arrived at the start. Gagarin reports his readiness for flight and follows the elevator. Exactly at 9 o'clock 7 o'clock Moscow time, Yuri Gagarin entered the history of mankind by launching into space from the Baikonur steppe. And 108 minutes after the launch, Yuri Gagarin, having made one revolution around the Earth, landed safely in another steppe, Saratov. Surprisingly, here, too, Soviet specialists managed to deceive the world community. Yuri Gagarin ejected from a descent vehicle at an altitude of 6 kilometers and landed on an ordinary parachute. But it was announced to the whole world that he returned to Earth in a descent vehicle. For the International Aeronautics Organization to register a Soviet record. In fact, in the descent capsule, only astronauts began to return, flying on ships of the next generation called Voskhod, and all the first cosmonauts of the USSR returned from near-Earth upholstered on ordinary parachutes. For months after Yuri Gagarin, on August 6, 1961, cosmonaut number 2 of the planet Earth German Titov launched into low Earth orbit. His flight lasted more than a day. Titov stayed in space for 25 hours and 11 minutes, making 17 orbits around the Earth. The next manned flight took place only a year later. But this was the first group flight. On August 11, 1962, Andrei and Nikolaev started on the Vostok 3 spacecraft from Baikonur, and the next day Pavel Popovich joined him on the Vostok 4 spacecraft. Two-way radio communication was established between the spacecraft. The next flight was also a group flight, and after Vostok 5 was launched into near-Earth orbit on June 14, 1963 with Valery Bykovsky on board. 2 days later Vostok 6 launched from Baikonur with the first woman cosmonaut, Valentina Tereshkova. Tereshkova spent 70 hours and 41 minutes in space, while Valery Bykovsky remained in orbit for a record-breaking 119 hours at the time. With this, the era of spaceships of the Vostok series ended. Sergei Pavlovich Korolev and the Baikonur testers were preparing a new modified ship. Therefore, the next manned flight had to wait more than a year. A new 3-seat Voskhod spacecraft with a crew of cosmonauts Vladimir Komarov, Konstantin Feoktistov and Boris Yegorov was launched from the Baikonur Cosmodrome on October 12, 1964. We also inherited the tragedy of the Soviet cosmonautics. Baikonur entered the history of mankind not only with the highest achievements. Unfortunately, the world's first cosmodrome was not without tragedies. The first and largest accident in the history of rocket and space technology occurred at Baikonur on October 24, 1960. During electrical tests on an already refueled R-16 rocket, designed by academician Mikhail Yanggel, the drain valve for launching the second stage unexpectedly worked. And the rocket exploded at launch. At the same time, more than 200 tons of rocket fuel caught fire. The fire killed 79 testers, about 50 more people were burned and injured. Artillery Marshal Mitrofan Nedolin, who was sitting on a chair not far from the rocket, also died. But the designer Yanggel remained alive thanks to an accident. He had just gone behind the bunker to smoke. Another specialist from the Zagorsk Research Institute Kimash, who worked on a rocket at a height of more than 10 meters, remained alive. Thanks to his professionalism, when he heard the click of the drainage valve, the specialist realized what was about to happen. Shouting to colleagues, "Save yourself! Now it's going to explode!" He jumped from a huge height and ran from the start against the wind. It is said that this was the only rocket man working directly on the product that managed to survive. The Soviet government then concealed the fact of such a terrible tragedy. And in the press it was stated that Marshal Nedolin died in a plane crash. Marshal of the USSR was buried in the Kremlin wall, and the rest of the dead were laid to rest in a mass grave on the outskirts of the city. For several days, bulldozers dug a huge pit, and General Secretary Khrushchev and the future leader of the USSR Brezhnev arrived at the funeral of the rocket men. Unfortunately, the day of October 24 became fatal for the Baikonur Cosmodrome. Exactly 3 years later, to the day, people died again due to a fire in a rocket silo. After these two disasters, no launch or test work is carried out at the spaceport on October 24, and this day is declared a day of mourning. And the whole of Baikonur gathers on October 24 for a morning meeting at the mass grave of the testers. There were also 2 tragedies in the manned cosmonautics of the USSR. They were connected with the development of space technology. In 1962, a completely new Soyuz spacecraft was ready for launch. However, he began to fly only at the end of 1966. As in the case of previous ships, the first 3 launches of the Soyuz were unsuccessful. On November 28, 1966, the first unmanned ship of this series collapsed upon returning from orbit, and on December 14, the ship exploded at the start due to an unexpectedly triggered emergency rescue system and practically completely turned the launch complex of 31 sites, which is the twin brother of the Gagarin launch. The third unmanned Soyuz, launched into orbit on February 7, 1967, which was supposed to stay in space for more than a week, flew only 2 days due to malfunctions on board, and when landing, he hit the ice of the Aral Sea and sank. It has not been possible to find him, and yet, a man flew on such an imperfect ship. I want to remind you that 1967 was the year of the 50th anniversary of the October Revolution. and it was decided to dedicate another breakthrough in the development of outer space to this anniversary. In April, with an interval of 1 day, 2 Soyuz were to launch, dock in orbit and transfer cosmonauts from one ship to another. Cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov was appointed commander of the main crew. Few people know that Yuri Gagarin was his understudy. Komarov launched on Soyuz 1 on April 23, 1967. But immediately after entering the near-Earth orbit, problems began on the spacecraft. The left solar battery did not open, the orientation engines did not work, and it became clear that the ship with Vladimir Komarov needed to be returned to Earth. And here the first tragedy in the history of Soviet manned cosmonautics occurred. When landing on the Soyuz, the brake parachute did not open. Cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov died when the spacecraft hit the ground at a speed of 35 to 40 meters per second. At the same time, the soft landing engines also exploded. The second time, the astronauts also died during landing. Georgy Dobrovolsky, Vladislav Volkov and Viktor Patsev launched into orbit on June 6, 1971 on the Soyuz 11 spacecraft. This crew was the first in the history of space exploration to dock with the very first Salyut, one orbital complex in the world, and was the first to work on board for 23 days. The misfortune happened on June 30 after the Soyuz 11 undocked from the orbital station. The brake engines fired and the ship began to descend. During the ejection of the orbital compartment in the descent vehicle, a pressure equalization valve suddenly opened, and all the air leaked into the vacuum. The descent vehicle made a soft landing. But when the search party opened the hatch of the spacecraft, the astronauts were dead. They died of suffocation. The tragedy also happened because of the race. 3 cosmonauts in spacesuits could not fit into the cramped Voskhod. And in order to still send the crew to the station, they decided to start and land without spacesuits. But after the tragedy of June 30, 1971, starting from the Soyuz 12 spacecraft, all astronauts starting into near-Earth orbit again put on spacesuits. But Dobrovolsky, Volkov and Patsev were supposed to go on a space flight only on the next ship, and in June 1971 they duplicated the crew of Leonov, Kubasov and Kolbin. But 3 days before the start, doctors found dark spots in Valery Kubasov's lungs, and understudies took off on Soyuz 11 to meet their tragic fate. Even the famous cosmonaut Leonov admitted that he considers June 1971 his second birthday. And candidate cosmonaut Kolbin never flew into space, ending his career in the cosmonaut corps. Of course, after the death of 3 cosmonauts at once, the conclusions were made immediately, and the list of the dead Soviet space explorers was no longer replenished. Although twice more, at the launch of the manned Soyuz, the equipment failed. On January 5, 1975, cosmonauts Vasily Lazarev and Oleg Makarov launched on the Soyuz 17 spacecraft to the Salyut 4 orbital station. However, on the active leg of the flight, during the separation of the first and second stages of the launch vehicle, an accident occurred. The crew of the ship had to shoot back from the rocket. Cosmonauts Lazarev and Makarov, who for the first time experienced the operation of the Emergency Rescue System, SAS, managed to land in Altai. And the emergency ship received the official name Soyuz 17-1. And for the second time, the SAS system had to be used on September 26, 1983, when the rocket with astronauts on board caught fire at the moment of launch right at the start. According to eyewitnesses, the crew of the Soyuz spacecraft was saved only thanks to the engineering intuition of the famous space technology tester Alexei Alexandrovich Shumilin, who managed to notice that something was wrong with the ship and ordered the emergency rescue system to be turned on a few seconds earlier than about the fire-reported automation. The descent vehicle, in which cosmonauts Vladimir Tidov and Gennady Strekalov were, fired off a burning rocket and landed on a parachute 1.5 kilometers from the start. The rescued cosmonauts, a few minutes later, were already watching the fire that raged at the Gagarin launch. Fortunately, there were no more such accidents at Baikonur. To the envy of so many countries, we created Energia with Buran. On May 15, 1987, a grandiose event took place at the Baikonur Cosmodrome. The world's most powerful Energia rocket was launched into space, which could put about 100 tons of payload into low Earth orbit. The main task for the Energia launch vehicle was to be the delivery of the Soviet reusable space shuttle Buran into orbit. True, Energia set off on its first flight with another cargo, a module called the Pole. The Soviet authorities assured that it was a large orbital plant for the production of crystals in space. Western media claimed that the Soviets were planning to launch a powerful space laser. But the orbital module did not get into orbit. When separated from the launch vehicle, the Polyus did not turn on its own propulsion system, and it completed its journey into space in the waters of the world ocean. By the way, due to the fact that in the spring of 1987 the launch complex for the Energieburen system at the 110th site of the Cosmodrome was not yet ready, and the party and the government demanded the success of the Soviet cosmonautics. Therefore, on its first flight, Energia was launched from the Universal Start Stand, which was built on the Square 250 for testing, the so-called burning, the engines of the most powerful rocket in the world. The launch was carried out in such a hurry that the cooling system of the launch complex did not work, which in seconds was supposed to pour a whole lake of water around the flame of the engines of the launching rocket. As a result, huge concrete slabs flew around the launch complex, covering many structures of the 110th site. They forgot to disconnect one of the cables, which could lead to the fall of the rocket. The footage of the documentary chronicle shows that at the first moment of separation from the launch pad, the rocket tilted slightly, but due to its power, Energia pulled out this cable, leveled off and rushed up. 250 for testing, the so-called burning, the engines of the most powerful rocket in the world. The launch was carried out in such a hurry that the cooling system of the launch complex did not work, which in seconds was supposed to pour a whole lake of water around the flame of the engines of the launching rocket. As a result, huge concrete slabs flew around the launch complex, covering many structures of the 110th site. They forgot to disconnect one of the cables, which could lead to the fall of the rocket. The footage of the documentary chronicle shows that at the first moment of separation from the launch pad, the rocket tilted slightly, but due to its power, Energia pulled out this cable, leveled off and rushed up. 250 for testing, the so-called burning, the engines of the most powerful rocket in the world. The launch was carried out in such a hurry that the cooling system of the launch complex did not work, which in seconds was supposed to pour a whole lake of water around the flame of the engines of the launching rocket. As a result, huge concrete slabs flew around the launch complex, covering many structures of the 110th site. They forgot to disconnect one of the cables, which could lead to the fall of the rocket. The footage of the documentary chronicle shows that at the first moment of separation from the launch pad, the rocket tilted slightly, but due to its power, Energia pulled out this cable, leveled off and rushed up, which in seconds was supposed to pour a whole lake of water around the flame of the engines of the launching rocket. As a result, huge concrete slabs flew around the launch complex, covering many structures of the 110th site. They forgot to disconnect one of the cables, which could lead to the fall of the rocket. The footage of the documentary chronicle shows that at the first moment of separation from the launch pad, the rocket tilted slightly, but due to its power, Energia pulled out this cable, leveled off and rushed up, which in seconds was supposed to pour a whole lake of water around the flame of the engines of the launching rocket. As a result, huge concrete slabs flew around the launch complex, covering many structures of the 110th site. They forgot to disconnect one of the cables, which could lead to the fall of the rocket. The footage of the documentary chronicle shows that at the first moment of separation from the launch pad, the rocket tilted slightly, but due to its power, Energia pulled out this cable, leveled off and rushed up. By the way, literally on the eve of the first launch of Energia, the Baikonur Cosmodrome was visited by General Secretary of the CPSU Mikhail Gorbachev. And, although Gorbachev spent several days at the Cosmodrome, the head of the USSR did not stay to look at the experimental launch. You never know. And exactly 1.5 years later, Energia launched from a regular launch complex with a reusable Buran spacecraft. Unfortunately, Buran flew into space in automatic mode only once, in the fall of 1988. The participants in that historic launch later sadly joked, "Then, on November 15, 1988, we did not yet know that we were simultaneously participating in 2 Buran launches at once, the first and the last." The space shuttle turned out to be too expensive a toy even for the Soviet government. And the Energieburen program was closed. Thus, the inscription, DMB, scratched on the skin of the Soviet space shuttle by one of the guards a year before the launch, during the training installations of the system at the launch complex, turned out to be prophetic. And the history of the Energieburen space system itself ended on May 12, 2002. True, in the November days of 1988, Baikonur specialists could not have known anything of this and were celebrating their outstanding victory. Indeed, for the first time in world history, a space shuttle not only successfully launched in an unmanned mode, but also made a filigree automatic landing, deviating from the center of a special landing strip by less than a meter. Not surprisingly, some developments of this program are still used today. The main one is the Zenit launch vehicle, the first stage of which was developed as side engines for the Energia launch vehicle. Today, a new generation environmentally friendly medium-class rocket Zenit 3SL is the main launch vehicle of the Sea Launch project of the international company SciLaunch. By the way, this company is also implementing a part of its project called Start from the Desert at the Baikonur Cosmodrome. The first Kazakh cosmonaut also took off in the Baikonur space steps. For the first time, the first secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Kazakh SSR, Dinmikhail Kunaev, had plans to send into space a native representative of the Republic, on whose territory the world's first cosmodrome is located, back in the early 80s of the last century. But the Tag Bear, who came to power in the USSR, removed Kunaev from the leadership of the Republic. And the plans were just plans. In fairness, it should be noted that the Kazakhstanis actively participated in the conquest of outer space. Only a native of Petropavlovsk, Alexander Viktorenko, launched into low Earth orbit 4 times, but the desire to see their cosmonaut among the conquerors of the stellar heights remained among the Kazakh people. And the dream of the people about the conquest of outer space managed to be realized by the first president of independent Kazakhstan, Nursultan Nazarbayev. An agreement to launch the first Kazakh cosmonaut was signed between the presidents of the USSR and Kazakhstan in 1990. And the then Federal Republic of the Soviet Union began recruiting candidates for astronauts back in 1989. The space flight of a representative of the Kazakh people was supposed to mark the significant contribution of Kazakhstan to the space industry of the USSR. And in October 1991, the first Kazakh cosmonaut launched into space from the Baikonur Cosmodrome. This honor fell to the outstanding son of the Kazakh people Tokhtar Orbakirov. The choice of the president of Kazakhstan was not accidental. At that time, Tokhtar Ongabayevich was an honored test pilot of the USSR, a hero of the Soviet Union. According to experts, Orbakirov was the best fit for the role of the first Kazakh cosmonaut. Talgat Musabayev, a civil aviation pilot, master of sports in aerial aerobatics, was chosen as his understudy. By the way, Tokhtar Orbakirov, who became not only the first cosmonaut of independent Kazakhstan, but also the last, 72nd cosmonaut of the USSR. In addition, Tokhtar Ongabayevich was the first of a new generation of cosmonauts who launched into space, already being a hero of the Soviet Union. Moreover, they received this title in peacetime. Before him, only the heroes of the USSR, who performed feats on the fronts of the Great Patriotic War, flew into low Earth orbit. The fact that the flight of the first Kazakh cosmonaut was a political matter is confirmed by the fact that initially Russians Alexander Volkov, Alexander Kaleri, and a research cosmonaut from Austria were planned as members of the 10th main expedition to the Mir orbital complex. Moreover, the main crew had 2 backup compositions at once, Viktorenko Aviv and Solovyov Zaitsev. But in January 1991, the leadership of the USSR decided to launch a cosmonaut of Kazakhstan. Initially, it was planned to carry out a Kazakh visiting expedition in November 1991. After the launch of the expedition with an Austrian cosmonaut. However, the lack of funds already in the middle of the year put these plans in jeopardy. There was no money for 2 ships and 2 missiles. And, therefore, the State Commission decided to combine the Soviet-Austrian flight with the expedition of a Kazakh cosmonaut. Flight engineers were withdrawn from the main and backup Soviet-Austrian crews, and Kazakh researchers took their places. Because of this change, flight engineer Sergei Krikalev had to be left for another 6 months in near-Earth orbit at the Mir station, who, as a result of these rearrangements, was the first in the world to work in space for more than a year. It is noteworthy that Tokhtar Orbakirov, who is a real Kazakh beta, did not qualify for the role of an astronaut in any physical parameter. The height and weight of the Kazakh hero significantly exceeded all permissible norms that provided for the parameters of the Soyuz TM spacecraft. Nevertheless, the flight of the first Kazakh cosmonaut took place. Especially for Tokhtar Ongabayevich, specialists made a special seat lodge of the spacecraft and a personal spacesuit. By the way, on the day of celebration of the 15th anniversary of Tokhtar Orbakirov's flight, crew commander Alexander Volkov and cosmonaut researcher Franz Fiebeck arrived in Astana to congratulate their colleague. During the preparation and launch of Tokhtar Orbakirov, many events took place at Baikonur, which were given the status of, for the first time. For the first time, Kazakh yurts were installed in the cosmonaut hotel. For the first time, cosmonauts were able to try Beshbarmak and Plav on the eve of the launch. For the first time, They communicated with the mullah, other crew doctors who were responsible for observing the observational regime, sanitary cleanliness of the crew before the flight, were worried. History is silent about this, despite the fact that Tokhtar Ongubevich flew on the Soyuz TM spacecraft number 13, the launch and the entire flight of the first Kazakh cosmonaut went off without a hitch. The only problem arose during landing. During the so-called soft landing, the descent vehicle tilted heavily and Austrian cosmonaut Franz Fiebeck fell on Orbakirov. Experts later said that if the opposite had happened, an international scandal could have happened. Franz Fiebeck risked being crushed to death by a Kazakh beta. I want to note that cosmonaut Yuri Bacharin commented very figuratively on the softness of the landing of the Soyuz descent module. After his first landing, he told the rescuers, "Is this what you call a soft landing?" Yes, it's like a head-on collision on a Shiguli. Even at the observation post of the Baikonur Cosmodrome, immediately after the launch of Soyuz TM-13, the President of Kazakhstan at a special press conference announced the creation of the Institute of Space Research in the country. And then the National Aerospace Agency of the Republic of Kazakhstan was formed. And it was headed by Tokhtar Orbakirov after his triumphal flight. His understudy, Talgat Musabayev, did not remain without space work. Moreover, if Tokhtar Ongubevich became the first Kazakh cosmonaut, then Talgat Amanjaldevich opened the space era of independent Kazakhstan. On July 1, 1994, together with the ship's commander Yuri Malenchenko, Talgat Musabayev went on a 6-month shift into space. It is noteworthy that after returning from orbit, both crew members were awarded the highest awards of Kazakhstan, the Order of Halik Kahamani, Hero of Kazakhstan. Until now, Yuri Malenchenko is the only foreign cosmonaut who has been awarded such a high award. Meanwhile, immediately after his first flight, Talgat Musabayev proposed to the President of Kazakhstan to create a national cosmonaut squad. For several years, this proposal was carefully studied by Kazakhstani specialists. And already in April 1999, at the highest level in Moscow, an agreement was reached that the Russian Federation would help Kazakhstan in creating its own cosmonaut corps. And for 3 years, from 2000 to 2002, the selection of candidates for cosmonauts was carried out in the Republic of Kazakhstan. Out of more than 2,000 applicants, 2 Kazakhs were chosen, Aidin Aimbatov and Mukhtar Imakhanov. It is noteworthy that Mukhtar Imakhanov was born just 70 kilometers from Baikonur, in the regional center of Karmaksha. But before these epochal events, Talgat Musabayev flew into space twice more. In 1998, he worked for 6 months at the Mir orbital station and entered the Guinness Book of Records as an astronaut who made 6 spacewalks in one flight, having worked overboard the station for more than 30 hours. And during his second flight in 1998, Musabayev completed many scientific programs, both Russian and domestic. But Talgat Amanjaldevich himself, probably, most of all liked the Dastakhan experiment, which was prepared by scientists from the Kazakh Academy of Sciences. After all, trying the best dishes of Kazakh national cuisine in space is worth a lot. By the way, Talgat Musabayev, together with his flight engineer Nikolai Buterin, on May 31, 1998, when the Earth celebrated Anti-Smoking Day, were recognized as the most distant people from our planet who gave up this addiction. In addition, Musabayev did not change his favorite pastime in space, to sing with a guitar. For playing music, he had his own guitar at the Mir station, which the Kabar television agency gave him into low Earth orbit. Musabayev even took part in the International Music Festival, Asia Dawasi, Voice of Asia, during his second flight. Moreover, the Kazakh cosmonaut sang a duet from orbit with the famous Kazakh performer Nurlan Onabayev. The second singer at that time, of course, was at the Medio High Mountain skating rink, where the competition was held. And then Talgat Musabayev once again entered the history of astronautics as the commander of the ship that brought the first tourist to the International Space Station. After that, Musabayev was given the nickname, Space Taxi Driver, in the Cosmonaut Corps. But Talgat Amanjaldevich stormed not only space heights. He showed himself to be a serious scientist. Musabayev's PhD thesis made such an impression on the academic council that the Kazakh cosmonaut was immediately awarded a doctoral degree by the Higher Attestation Commission. A few years later, Talgat Musabayev was elected a member of the International Academy of Cosmonautics. It should be noted that for a long time Talgat Musabayev was an officer in the Russian army and a citizen of Russia. But recently, at the invitation of the President of Kazakhstan, the cosmonaut returned to his homeland and headed the newly created National Space Agency. True, the motherland did not receive the cosmonaut very kindly, At first he was rolled in the elections to the lower house of parliament, the Majlis. And then, after the loss of the first national communications satellite, Kazakhstan, in the fall of 2008, they immediately tried to hang all the dogs directly on Musabayev, despite the fact that the head of Kazakhstan took up his duties only in April 2007. And he had nothing to do with the creation and launch of the first national satellite of Kazakhstan. Let me remind you what happened to the first Kazakhstan. The first national satellite of Kazakhstan was launched into space from Baikonur on June 18, 2006. And less than 2 years later, on Sunday, June 8, 2008 at 9 a.m. Astana time, due to a failure of the onboard digital computer system, broadcasting of all Kazakhstani TV channels through Kazakhstan was interrupted. The satellite ceased to obey the commands of the mission control centers in the city of Akol and Skolkovo near Moscow, which controlled the flight of the spacecraft. Multiple attempts to remove the Kazakhstan satellite from the current situation did not give any results. 28 minutes after the failure, the head of the National Space Agency, Talgat Musabayev, ordered to turn off the onboard radio equipment, which provided a signal to all communication and television channels. And an instant notification was made to all telecom operators that the satellite's performance was temporarily lost, in connection with which, consumers were asked to switch to backup channels. And in October, Kazakhstan was officially recognized as lost for Kazakhstan. It should be noted that the contract with the Russian Khrunichev Space Center for the manufacture and launch of the first Kazakh geostationary spacecraft was signed by Kazakh government structures back in January 2004. Despite the fact that this is the first experience of creating a telecommunications satellite at the Khrunichev Center, the company's management assured the Kazakh side that Kazakhstan would be the most modern satellite. And at first everything seemed to be going well, both manufacturing and launching into geostationary orbit. But the first national satellite of Kazakhstan went haywire exactly 10 days before its second anniversary in Earth orbit. Although he had to work in space for at least 10 years. Many experts argued that the failure of Kazakhstan should be taken for granted. Equipment sometimes breaks down. But only this satellite had too many prerequisites for breakdowns. And experts say that the main problem of the first Kazakhstan is that several departments of Kazakhstan, which are very far from astronautics, were involved in the preparation of the contract for the manufacture of the satellite. As Talgat Musabayev stated at a press conference, Kazakhstan is the brainchild of that period and those people who did not understand anything in the space business. Unfortunately, that was the case, said the head of Kazakhstan. One satellite project was in the Agency for Informatization and Communications, another, in the Ministry of Education and Science, the third, somewhere else, and the fourth, in the National Innovation Fund. But they ordered the first satellite of Kazakhstan, our pride. But that pride turned into mere space junk in October 2008. The spiteful critics failed to link the failure with the work in orbit of the first national satellite of Kazakhstan to the activities of the National Space Agency. How Kazakhstan failed to quarrel with the Russian Space Agency. And this is good news. Because the space industry of Kazakhstan will successfully develop in the future only in close cooperation with Roscosmos. And the second telecommunications satellite was created by the Russian Khrunichev Center. True, with serious modifications. The president of Kazakhstan Nursultan Nazarbayev personally asked Russian Prime Minister Vladimir Putin to increase the reliability of the Kazakhstan-2 satellite being created jointly with Russia. You remember what happened with the first satellite. We ask you to increase the strength, so to speak, the combat capability of the second satellite. Vladimir Putin, for his part, agreed with this need and noted that cooperation in space for Russia and Kazakhstan has become a traditional area. We expect that this will not only benefit the space industry of the Russian Federation, but will also serve the development of the Kazakhstani space industry. There are all prerequisites for this. This is not only Baikonur, but also other groundwork. And Talgat Musabayev, together with the specialists of the National Space Agency headed by him, for the first time in the history of the country, created the strategy for the development of the space industry of Kazakhstan. And finally, some statistics. 2 Kazakhstani cosmonauts flew into space only 4 times by the beginning of the 21st century. But in terms of flying hours, they took 3rd place in the world after Russia and the United States. In the meantime, new cosmonauts of Kazakhstan are preparing to storm the space heights, putting historical milestones on the way. You can't get around the secrets of Baikonur. Speaking about the space achievements of the Baikonur Cosmodrome, one cannot fail to say that another name for the Cosmodrome is Test Site Number 5. And that it was here that the most modern rocket weapons of the Soviet Union were tested. It is no coincidence that until recently the vast majority of Baikonur specialists were military men. As the people of Baikonur say, the rocket shield of the motherland was forged here. It was military experts who taught the world's most formidable SS-18 and SS-20 missiles to fly, which terrified the West and therefore were nicknamed by the Americans Satan and Stiletto. The US leadership was literally shocked when it learned that at Baikonur in the late 60s a brigade of R-36 missiles, designed by academician Yangel, on which orbital warheads were installed, took up combat duty. Naturally, and with a nuclear stuffing. And these missiles could attack America from space from any direction, including from the direction of the South Pole, where the Americans at that time did not have even the simplest means of tracking. It is quite understandable that in the Treaty on the Limitation of Strategic Offensive Arms, the US military, in the first place, sought to ban precisely these missiles. The West achieved its goal, most of the formidable Soviet combat missiles were destroyed, and the rest were converted into conversion space launch vehicles. And on Baikonur itself, only a few active silo launchers remained. Who receives information from orbit, he will never be beaten. For some reason, the Soviet people had an idea about the Baikonur Cosmodrome that literally everything in the space harbor was saturated with radiation. Until recently, when people found out that a person lives in Baikonur, the first question always sounded like this: does radiation not affect you much? In fact, work with radioactive materials was carried out only at one site of the Cosmodrome, Square 94A, which was removed from the city by almost 100 kilometers. The fact is that at the height of the Cold War, the United States and the USSR paid special attention to conducting space reconnaissance. And given the fact that in the 60s spy satellites flew in so-called low orbits up to 120 kilometers high, it was necessary to develop new types of power plants for the reconnaissance spacecraft. After all, orbital spies could not afford the luxury of having solar arrays over 20 meters long. Soviet designers decided to use small nuclear reactors as onboard power batteries for space Sterlitz. One of the main tasks for the USSR at that time was the need to constantly monitor all movements of the ships of the US Navy, which significantly outnumbered the Soviet one both in numbers and in combat equipment. Therefore, it was decided to install nuclear power plants on satellites of marine intelligence of the US series, controlled satellite. The first launch of a radar satellite of the USA series with a nuclear reactor called Buck was carried out in 1965. The first two spy satellites equipped with a nuclear power plant were launched by the Royal R-7 rocket from the 31st site of the Baikonur Cosmodrome. And the rest were launched by the Cyclone 2 launch vehicle from the launch complex of Pad 90. In addition to spy satellites, interceptor satellites were also equipped with nuclear reactors. In total, until the spring of 1988, when the program was completely closed, more than 40 space reconnaissance aircraft of the USA series were launched from Baikonur. A major problem with nuclear-powered satellites was their short orbital lifetime. Each reconnaissance satellite could work in space for no more than 2 to 3 months. And then the satellites were transferred to the so-called burial orbits with a height of about 1,000 kilometers. At this height, according to scientists, the spent reactor can be from 300 to 600 years. The answer to the question of what to do with these nuclear bombs overhead will have to be decided by our descendants. But still, the main problem was the unfinished system for placing satellites into burial orbits. After one of the satellites of the USA series, as a result of a spontaneous deorbit, fell on the territory of Canada on January 28, 1978, launches under this program had to be suspended until 1982. And not smart. The fall of a satellite with a nuclear installation led to radioactive contamination of the territory of 100,000 square kilometers. To hush up the scandal, the Soviet government had to pay Canada more than $3 million of those full-weight dollars. The designers tried to improve the satellites with reactors of the Buck series in terms of radiation safety. But nothing has been achieved. In 1987, the Buck reactor program was closed. The Bukami were replaced by a new generation of nuclear power plants called Topaz. These reactors extended the lifespan of space spyware to 3 years. But this program also suffered from the unreliability of the satellite removal system. And although there were no major accidents with Topaz satellites, the existing danger forced the designers to abandon the use of nuclear fuel as onboard power for spy satellites. The last launch of the USA Marine Radar Reconnaissance Satellite took place on March 14, 1988. The program of launching satellites with nuclear reactors was so secret that only by the end of the 80s, as always, from the Western press, Baikonur residents were surprised to learn that such spacecraft had been launched from the 90th site of the Cosmodrome for almost 20 years. The final point in the epic of these satellites was put by the Intergovernmental Kazakh-Russian Commission on the Baikonur Complex, which in the summer of 1999 decided to bury all available radioactive waste from Site 94A, in the burial ground of the Semipalatinsk nuclear test site. The last waste was removed from Baikonur at the beginning of the 21st century. And this satellite, no doubt, will be able to destroy any enemy on command. If the history of USA satellites ended in 1988, then interceptor satellites, freed from nuclear power plants, remained a headache for the American authorities for a long time. When the US began developing a missile defense system in 1983 as part of President Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, only a few in the Soviet Union knew at the time that this was the US government's response to the development of the Soviet Space Interceptor System. The American Anti-Satellite Interceptor MHV with an infrared guidance system passed the first flight tests only in 1984, and the first successful test of a Soviet interceptor satellite took place on November 1, 1968. On this day, a satellite fighter launched from the Baikonur Cosmodrome under the name Cosmos 252 carried out the destruction of a target satellite launched under the symbol Cosmos 248 in near-Earth orbit. The scheme of action of the anti-satellite complex looked as follows. After the launch, the satellite fighter was launched into a near-Earth orbit lying in the plane of the target satellite's orbit. On command from the Earth, that space killer was escorted to the target capture zone by the onboard radar homing head. After capturing the target, the interceptor approached the alien satellite at a distance of up to 1 kilometer and blew up a fragmentation warhead. The target is destroyed by numerous fragments. On Soviet interceptor spacecraft, both a two-turn interception scheme was used, when the target was approached and destroyed on the second orbit around the Earth after launch, approximately 3.5 hours after launch, and a single turn one, which made it possible to destroy a spy satellite in less than 50 minutes. The anti-satellite interception complex included the satellite fighter itself, the launch vehicle, the technical and launch complexes, and the ground command and computing center. All the main elements of the anti-satellite system were created by 1967. A command and measurement point equipped with a radar station was deployed in the Moscow region, and technical and launch complexes were deployed at the Baikonur Cosmodrome. At the same time, the first radar station was tested to solve the problem of controlling outer space. This radar, called the Ussr, was located on the territory of our Republic of Kazakhstan. And already in 1970, the first stage of the Space Control Center was put on combat duty, which was fully put into service in 1972. It is quite clear that the anti-satellite system has been constantly improved. A special series of tests proved the possibility of intercepting orbital targets at altitudes from 150 to 1,600 kilometers. Moreover, in addition to working on increasing the range of altitudes and reducing the minimum interception time, the designers were simultaneously developing new systems for radar and infrared targeting. In total, from 1963 to 1982, in the course of work on a system for countering space objects, 41 spacecraft were launched from the Baikonur Cosmodrome. The last test of the Soviet anti-satellite system took place on June 18, 1982. But it was quite spectacular and was carried out as part of the largest exercises of the Soviet nuclear forces. These exercises in the West were nicknamed the 7-Hour Nuclear War. On that day, 2 silo-based intercontinental missiles SS-11, a medium-range missile SS-20 and a ballistic missile from a submarine were launched in the USSR for 7 hours. 2 anti-missiles were fired at the warheads of these missiles. Meanwhile, a satellite destroyer intercepted and destroyed a target simulating the U.S. navigation satellite transit. In addition, within 3 hours between the launch of the interceptor and its rendezvous with the target, a navigation satellite and a photographic reconnaissance satellite were launched from the Plesetsk and Baikonur cosmodromes. This Soviet demonstration became the decisive impetus for the deployment in the United States of work on the creation of a new generation anti-satellite system, which we know as the SDI program. After the Americans created their F-15 MHV anti-missile system, negotiations on ending the arms race in space between the USSR and the USA were very tense and long. The Soviet government either declared a moratorium on tests, then started them again. Only in December 1985, when the US Congress prohibited further testing of the American system until the USSR actually refrained from testing its own, the Soviet Union stopped launching fighter satellites. By the way, today the American leadership, which is preparing to break the agreements reached earlier on missile defense, is at great risk, despite the fact that the American MHV program was completely closed in 1988. Work on improving anti-satellite weapons in the Soviet Union did not seem to stop. Judging by the fact that in April 1991, the new ISMU anti-space defense complex was put into operation, what was the hysteria in the USA when we could storm America? Another headache for the American government was the missile formation created at Baikonur in the late 60s, which had no analogues in the world, a brigade of orbital missiles created on the basis of R-36 ballistic missiles designed by academician Mikhail Yanggel. These missiles, equipped with 20 megaton nuclear warheads, could launch warheads into space and from there attack any point on the globe from any direction. Considering that the United States created its anti-missile defense with the expectation that Soviet missiles would fly to them along the shortest path, through the North Pole, it was impossible to come up with a better weapon for the first disarming strike. Soviet missiles, in case of war, were supposed to attack the United States through the South Pole, where the United States at that time did not even have radar stations capable of detecting nuclear warheads flying towards their territory. The two-stage R-36 orbital had a diameter of 3 meters, a length of more than 33 m. The rocket launched like an ordinary spacecraft and launched a warhead into space. When approaching the target, the braking propulsion system transferred the warhead from an orbital trajectory to a ballistic one. And the attack on the desired object began. The first launch of the R-36 orb was made from the mine launcher of the 67th site at Baikonur on December 16, 1965. The target was in Kamchatka. The launch was unsuccessful, due to malfunctions in the stabilization system. The warhead flew over the target by 27 kilometers. Then there were many more failures. And the very first successful test was the launch on January 25, 1967. In official TASS reports, the orbital warhead was named Cosmos 139. After a series of successful tests, on November 19, 1969, the combat missile system with the R-36 orb missile was adopted by the Soviet Army. And already the 1st Missile Regiment took up combat duty at Baikonur. It was armed with 6 rockets with orbital warheads, which were placed in silo launchers at a distance of 10 to 15 kilometers from each other. The number of duty shifts reached 170 people. Moreover, until the mid-70s, the calculations took up combat duty for a whole week. Orbital missiles remained a headache for the United States until the mid-70s, until the Americans put into operation an early warning system that fixed missiles not on approaching the target, but at the time of launch. As a result, orbital rockets have lost one of their main advantages, the surprise of the attack. Moreover, the R-36 orb complex was the first of the missile systems that was banned by the SALT II Treaty, concluded in 1979. And by the end of the 70s, the former formidable complex was replaced by new, more advanced ones in the USSR. And, nevertheless, the US government without delay allocated money for the destruction of silo launchers for the R-36 orb at Baikonur. Each orbital camera was happy with the next adjustment. Shepherds who grazed their flocks on the territory of the Baikonur Cosmodrome once asked me what kind of strange, huge and completely flat concrete areas covered with incomprehensible signs that shepherds come across in the steppe. The most surprising thing is that there is not a single object of the Cosmodrome near these sites overgrown with steppe grass. Maybe this is the work of aliens. But aliens have nothing to do with it. We have already said that one of the main tasks of military satellites was to conduct reconnaissance outside the territory of a potential enemy. To this end, the Soviet Union created a variety of modifications of photo reconnaissance spacecraft. For a long time, it was strictly classified information that several orbital stations flying in near-Earth orbit called the Salyut station were actually huge cameras that could capture many parts of the United States in some detail. The secret name of these stations is diamonds, but even such ultra-modern cameras needed adjustment from time to time. For this purpose, a unique complex was created at Baikonur in 1974, Object 135 Malawian Kwacha's, called the target ground complex. The target field, as the specialists called the complex, consisted of 7 huge sections with a total area of more than 120,000 square meters, which were concreted with a 10-centimeter layer of high-quality concrete. On 6 fields, special markings were applied, which represented dashed rectangles on concrete and stripes of various sizes in gray, black and white. The 7th section was allocated for the field of brightness, on which 4 multicolored squares were applied with paints, and the photo reconnaissance orbital vehicles were tuned like this. Flying over Baikonur, the spy satellite photographed the target complex for 10 to 12 seconds. At the same time, the target team of the complex, which consisted of 30 people, carried out ground measurements with a special photometer. This work was very difficult. More than 1,000 measurements were taken in one flight of the space reconnaissance. Then the results were processed for several hours. Comparison of the data obtained by the satellite and the ground team made it possible to adjust the lenses of each specific device and even improve the quality of satellite photographs by removing parasitic atmospheric influences, like clouds, haze, trembling of the surface air layer. At the same time, the parameters of the orbit of the satellite itself were refined. After commissioning, the complex was used for 15 years to work with all photo reconnaissance satellites that were launched from Baikonur. The warranty period of operation of the target ground complex ended in 1989. But by that time, with its help, a huge amount of experimental data had been accumulated. And computer processing of the accumulated data makes it possible today to do without this bulky structure. They say that somewhere and there were no secrets. But, probably, the most important secret of Baikonur has always been the life of those who send ships into space. From the moment the first builders of the future cosmodrome appeared in the steppe, courageous people have always lived in Baikonur, who steadfastly endured not only severe winter frosts and unbearable summer heat, but also the idiocy of the Soviet leadership that happened quite often. It is quite clear that the very first spaceport in the world was built in the strictest secrecy. Suffice it to recall the constantly changing names of the landfill number 5 under construction. This name was given to the secret object in the USSR Ministry of Defense: Moscow, 400, Tashkent, 90, Kyzyloda, 50, the village of Zaria, the village of Leninsky, the city of Leninsk, and the builders of the cosmodrome and specialists in rocket and space technology, who came here to serve or on very long business trips, wanted to communicate with their relatives who remained on the mainland. Naturally, there could be no mention of the place of service or the object itself. Censorship was cruel. But the address itself, to which relatives could write to the Baikonur residents, turned out to be a BAAL big secret. And the secrecy was quite serious. The young lieutenant, who could not stand the separation and settled his wife 78 kilometers from the new building, in the village of Jusali, who rode a motorcycle to her at night, after being caught in contact with his wife, received 3 years in prison. The circular, which was lowered from Moscow to the cosmodrome's postal address, came under the heading, Top Secret. That is, the address seems to need to be communicated to all Baikonur residents so that they can send it to their relatives. But the address is secret. What to do? Fortunately, the command of the cosmodrome decided at its own risk to allow the distribution of the postal address. People need to communicate with their families. The secrecy of the cosmodrome was guarded by numerous checkpoints. Military patrols kept order at all sites of the cosmodrome, including in the city itself. But life constantly introduced a new headache to the secret services. On the eve of the famous orbital docking of the Soviet Soyuz and the American Apollo, a delegation of the American Space Agency NASA was supposed to arrive at Baikonur. And how to hide the fact that the world-famous Baikonur Cosmodrome is actually a military training ground, decided to temporarily make all military civilians. During the visit, the officers were forbidden to appear on the streets of the city and the sites of the Cosmodrome in military uniform. The checkpoint inspectors were dressed in the uniform of traffic controllers and handed out traffic batons. The patrols also changed into civilian clothes and were given red armbands with the inscription, Druz Hinik. The conscripts, who could not be closed in the barracks because they were needed at facilities intended to be shown to the Americans, were dressed in black work uniforms. Allegedly, civilian specialists. But the Tsarishniks, for whom the status of Baikonur has not been a secret for a long time, did not buy into this cheap trick. They say that at one of the facilities a photographer approached a line of civilian specialists and, taking pictures, suddenly asked one of the guys, "How much time is left to serve?" The black-robed warrior automatically rapped out, 1 year. Such disguise continued almost until the end of the 80s during all the visits of foreign delegations to the spaceport. Only the President of France, General de Gaulle, was made an exception. But this was a political exception. The visit of the first leader of France took place on the eve of the adoption of an important decision, whether this country should join NATO or not. General de Gaulle at Baikonur was shown a salvo launch of ballistic missiles. 10 missiles were simultaneously launched from the silos of the test site. It seems that this spectacle greatly impressed the President of France, since this country did not join NATO. By the way, getting into the city of Leninsk itself, which has always been and remains closed and surrounded by a fence around the entire perimeter, was quite easy to get into. Taxi drivers, for an additional fee, could always take anyone who wanted to visit the city through checkpoints. Basically, residents of neighboring areas sought to get into the administrative center of the space harbor in order to buy, also for additional money, condensed milk, stewed meat and Hungarian apples, which were in short supply at that time. Someone in such an illegal way came to visit relatives. There were literally holes in the fence, which also did not contribute to the strengthening of the closed regime. There were also incidents that clearly demonstrated the punctures of the regime's service. Once, in the early 90s of the last century, either Belgian, either Danish journalists asked how they could get to the Cosmodrome. Well, they were sent to the service of the regime, which then was in charge of accreditation of media representatives. And it turned out that foreign correspondents arrived in the city without any permissions and coordination with the relevant services in Moscow. So, we looked at the light. To the question of the surprised members of the regime service how the foreigners got into the city, they calmly replied, taxi. It seems that foreign journalists did not even notice that they had illegally entered the closed city. To the question of the surprised members of the regime service how the foreigners got into the city, they calmly replied, taxi. It seems that foreign journalists did not even notice that they had illegally entered the closed city. To the question of the surprised members of the regime service how the foreigners got into the city, they calmly replied, taxi. It seems that foreign journalists did not even notice that they had illegally entered the closed city. Back in the early 60s, the Cosmodrome had its own television. But you can't envy the staff of Baikonur TV at that time. How to talk about the life of the city, if literally everything is secret? And also it was impossible to show in the frame of the military. Moreover, even here it reached the point of absurdity. The May Day and November demonstrations of workers were shown live by the Lenin TV studio. And so that someone in military uniform would not accidentally get into the frame, at the entrance of the columns of demonstrators to Lenin Square, specially appointed television employees had to catch the military who were in the columns and not allow them to enter the square. And the real Soyuz rocket, which was installed in honor of the 25th anniversary of the Cosmodrome, was placed not vertically, as, for example, at VDNKH, but at an angle. And also for reasons of secrecy, so that the rocket could not be seen from passenger trains passing by the Tyuratam station. Such was the regime of secrecy. But he also had his advantages. As veterans recall, in the 70s of the last century, even residents of the first floors on the very outskirts of the city could, without fear for their property and housing, calmly open their windows wide open on a summer evening. It was hot, and there were no air conditioners, take a bottle of dry wine and set off cool down on a river or on a hydrogen sulfide source. And strangers never climbed into open windows. At that time, my friends and I lived in a 3-room apartment, the so-called shared dormitory. And due to the fact that my friends regularly lost the keys to the lock of the front door, this very front door was simply removed and placed in the corridor. Thank you for downloading the book in the free electronic library royalib.ru, http://royalib.ru. Leave a review about the book, http://royalib.ru/comment/Akhmetov_Oleg/K_Kos Mosu_AUL.html. All books by the author, http://royalib.ru/author/Akhmetov_Oleg.html. There were snowstorms and blizzards. But we looked at it with humor. This is a bitter potion, daily life of Baikonur. In Soviet times, myths circulated around life in a space harbor about the fabulous well-being of those lucky ones who live in a closed military city. They say that their support is from Moscow. And with a total food shortage in the country, Baikonur residents simply gorge themselves on cheeses and sausages. Indeed, for residents of neighboring settlements, Bakener stores looked very presentable. Here you can find condensed milk, butter, and meat, as they said then, at the state price. True, all this abundance is one appearance. Because most products, including potatoes, were sold exclusively on coupons. For 1 coupon, a kilogram of meat per person per month, 200 grams of butter and 1 can of condensed milk, 10 kilograms of potatoes. Moreover, in order to buy good meat, it was necessary to have a familiar seller of the meat department. And in order to purchase non-rotten potatoes, people agreed to sort out perishable tubers in a vegetable store for half a day. Many may say that the above will not surprise anyone. But there was one hitch in Bakener. There was not a single market in the city until the beginning of the 90s of the last century. That is, products could only be bought in stores by coupons. Only a few residents of the city managed to get hold of a bunch of greens or fresh radishes. Those who had acquaintances in a small greenhouse that supplied the hospital and kindergartens with vitamin products. Only in summer, the inhabitants of the space harbor could buy vegetables and fruits in the suburban village of Tyuratam. Trading stalls with imported gifts of nature was located on the site of the current bus station. But this little market still had to be reached. And for 100,000 population then there were a little more than 3,000 personal cars. Buses did not run very often, to put it mildly. Its first bazaar within the city appeared in 1991, when store shelves were so empty that even cockroaches escaped from these outlets. And the people at that time had already begun to shuttle a little. And somehow, on one of the spring Sundays, people saw that a crowd had gathered on the paved area in front of the city thermal power plant, which served as a temporary parking lot for various vehicles. It turned out that some enterprising Bakener residents laid out clothes, shoes and other manufactured goods on impromptu shopping malls, newspapers and cardboard boxes on the ground. But it was very difficult to buy them. Gorbachev's law on the so-called unearned income has not yet been repealed. Officially, the goods here were exchanged for other things. But it was possible to buy, as they say, without attracting attention. This place of semi-trade, the inhabitants of the city immediately called the Field of Miracles. True, this embryonic city market was almost immediately attacked by the authorities. And what is remarkable, on the eve of the infamous August putsch of the State Committee for the State of Emergency, by order of the General, Deputy Head of the Cosmodrome for Logistics, on the night of August 18 to 19, the entire territory of the former parking lot was flooded with tar. But you can't just take the Bakener people so easily. The next Sunday the trade continued, and the sellers settled down around the place filled with tar. Moreover, after the failure of the coup, they began to trade openly. Gradually improvised trade tents appeared. A year later, the city authorities began to equip the city market. The costs were minimal. For the construction of shopping arcades, used metal pipes were taken from the territory of the deserted military units and old soldiers' beds. Some of these structures are still on the central universal market of Bakener today, and even the authorities consider September 26, 1991 to be the official birthday of the Bakener Central Market. Simultaneously with the appearance of the first spontaneous bazaar, an impromptu purely food bazaar was formed on a wasteland near Secondary School No. 3, which worked there for a couple of years, causing criticism from teachers and parents of students, until it moved opposite, to the empty building of the former technical library. Today, this outlet is known not only to Bakener residents, but also to the guests of the Cosmodrome, as a mini-market. But back to transportation. Despite the fact that there were a lot of buses in the Bakener Passenger Motor Transport Enterprise, PATP, most of the new vehicles were used to transport workers from space enterprises to the Cosmodrome facilities. And at best, only up to 10 not-so-new liaisons went to the city routes, which served 4 routes. The routes were called quite simply, Ring 1, Ring 2, Station 3, Station 4. And in the summer, on weekends, there was one less bus on these routes. It was sent to transport residents of the city to summer cottages, which were located in the area of the Crany airfield. It is noteworthy that the bus did not go to the airport itself, and Bakener residents had to make a lot of efforts to get on the plane. Someone asked friends with the car to throw it to the airfield. Someone was rescued by official vehicles. There were also service buses. The lucky ones managed to catch a taxi. We are lucky because PATP had only 11 GAZ, 24 taxis as Volga taxis. And not all of them traveled to the streets of the city every day. At the same time, taxi drivers were very reluctant to agree to take them to the airport even for double the cost. It was more profitable to drive around the city and to the station. Upon arrival at Baikonur, I also had to ask for a ride to get to the city, but getting to the extreme was not an extreme headache. It was much more difficult to buy a plane ticket. There were only 2 flights to Moscow a week. Therefore, already from the beginning of spring, a considerable number of Baikonur residents gathered for days on end near the only air ticket office in the city, who signed up for tickets. In these lists, sometimes I had to be marked for a month or more. Not surprisingly, for the inhabitants of the city of Leninsk of the Soviet era, the saying was very relevant. In order to live well, every resident of the city must have a familiar doctor, taxi driver, waiter, butcher and ticket clerk. Imagine how many of these necessary people should have been in the space harbor, if in the heyday of the cosmodrome at Baikonur, according to official data, about 100,000 people lived. By the way, for the first time this official figure was made public only in 1987, after a visit to the space harbor by the USSR Secretary General Mikhail Gorbachev. Prior to this, information about the number of Baikonur residents remained a secret, but there were always much more people at the cosmodrome, because the specialists sent from all over the Union lived on the sites of the cosmodrome and did not fall into the number of Baikonur residents. Not to mention the military units stationed at the facilities of the polygon number 5. Meanwhile, entire residential neighborhoods were at the 95th, 43rd and 32nd sites. And a real residential city was located on Site 113. It was empty in the winter of 1992, when the thermal power plant that heated this town burned down. Dilapidated high-rise buildings stand on the square. 113 so far. The lack of housing for business travelers. In Baikonur they were called business travelers, because specialists received very large daily allowances, was solved at the sites by prefabricated barracks and residential trailers. And grandiose housing construction was constantly going on in the city. Builders erected panel 5 and 9-story buildings in 6 months. But housing was still lacking. The number of new space programs, requiring a greater number of specialists, grew. Hundreds of graduates of military schools arrived at the cosmodrome every year. And all of them needed to be provided with a place to live. Some were placed in hostels. Who was more fortunate, in apartments, with sharing? This is when 2 families moved into a 2-room separate apartment at once. Such close proximity sometimes led to the fact that husbands changed wives, neighbors remarried, but vice versa. Problems with housing ceased to exist only after the mass exodus of military builders from the space harbor. But more on that later. And I want to complete the story about the life of the inhabitants of Baikonur in the last century with a story about another global problem: public toilets. These necessary houses did not exist in the city until the beginning of the 21st century. The absence of closets on the streets did not improve the life of the Baikonur residents, and gave rise to such a bike. Once a young lieutenant was returning to his hostel. But, apparently, he ate something wrong at lunch. The stomach took unexpectedly. Having shown military ingenuity, the young officer ran into the first entrance that came across. But do not think bad, the officer had the honor. He called the nearest apartment on the ground floor. The door was opened by a young girl. The lieutenant, blushing, explained the situation to her. The girl graciously allowed to use the amenities in her apartment. The young man probably had a very strong seizure because he spent about 20 minutes in the toilet. As he profusely apologized and thanked, the girl invited him to wash his hands and have dinner with her. They say that they dined together for 25 years. And only when they swore strongly, the husband said in his heart, "It would be better if I shit myself then." Much worse than any bad weather steel for the harbor, dark years. Baikonur has always been called the Soviet Union in miniature because enterprises from all over the USSR worked at the cosmodrome, and specialists from absolutely all the republics of the country of the Soviets worked in the space harbor itself. It is quite clear that the collapse of the Soviet Empire hit Baikonur the hardest. After the former fraternal republics began to scatter to their national quarters, the people of Baikonur for a long time were forgotten by the leadership of the newly independent countries, who were exclusively engaged in arranging the new statehood. And with all that, no one cancelled the tasks of the Space Center specialists to carry out space programs. And the Baikonur residents fulfilled these tasks with honor, despite very serious problems. The rockets from the cosmodrome launched strictly on schedule, but the rocket specialists themselves had a very, very hard life. The uncertainty of their future did not contribute to optimism. The mood of the majority of space harbor specialists was expressed by the participants of the main Baikonur KVN team, Golden Bionok, in their Tale of Buran, which has already become a classic. I hardly found the text of this work cheerful and resourceful. Because, the only time this tale was published in a small newspaper, International Space School, which in the early 90s was published in the Baikonur Educational Institution of the same name. But the tale did not reach the readers. The political department of the Cosmodrome seized the entire circulation, put several officers in a room and forced them to tear off the last page from the newspaper on which the Tale of Buran was printed. Only after that the newspaper got to subscribers. Tale of Buran. 3 ministers and commander-in-chief. They sat in the evening. Comrade Yazov began his speech. Space is ours without reusables. But in the United States, for example, launch the Challenger, in order not to embarrass us. We should also have our bird. Run, my general. So the second minister said. The minister of IOM took the floor. There is no rocket. What is it? My word is true. There will be a product for you. Time passed, the frost grew stronger. Someone knocked at the KGB. Misha sang, Boris was silent. And Jaeger was swinging right. Perestroika went on. This miracle began. Led the people's good. An old member of the Politburo, Motherland gave birth in the night. And not a son, and not a daughter. Not a ship, not a tank, not a gun. Not an unknown animal. To fear the Pentagon. And the flying car. He himself said, the process has begun. I found money for you. Anniversary of October. Run the hero. So that we can use this bird. Proud of the entire Soviet of deputies, and so that there is no idleness. All 6th Department. To those works and attract, and with the bones lie down, and he added, speaking. Ray told me yesterday. Baikonur is not nonsense, he is for a long time, forever. And hearing these words, everyone suddenly rushed to the rocket, and we decided to launch, suddenly take off. Motherfucker. At this time, over the hill. The White House was alarmed, sometime early in the morning. Amerikansk CIA looked into the lens. Showed a negative. And a secret agent. Sent to the president. In the USSR, life is not bad. They have such a miracle. Standing in the middle of the steppe. That which cannot be. None of the maps. Miracle Udo finish start, and a huge rocket. It's on the table at the same time. On the side there is an inscription, DMB. These are KGB tricks. There is another wonder. To the start of the locomotive playfully. Come up, raise a howl. We'll pour on the empty platform. 303 heroes. By the heat of morning grief, all the guys are gone. And the shoulder straps are blue. And green pants. Visible from space, everyone is smart as a selection. They smoke Canal Balumor. It's amazing, it's amazing. Also, during the drain. Atmospheric component. Shed, and at the moment. Smoke stands there like a wall, and you can't see a damn thing, between this year after year. Work was in full swing, and of course he succeeded. In fact, the political department helped the guys as best he could. With a well-aimed Lenin quote. Like a sharpened spear. Beat a single political day, or a winged slogan. He commanded a soldier. Or here, Buran is standing. Here comes the political officer, all at once, as it boils, all climbed up and down. Real communist, he says, the Secretary-General asked. Make Lenin sky compartment, there is a place for Marx. Next to the onboard first aid kit. And the bracket under Illich. We'll wrap it in tarpaulin, heal everyone, heal. Good Dr. Political Officer, the deadline crept up unnoticed, greeting telegram. From above began to hint. Isn't it time to launch? Finally that day has come. People are tired of waiting. Everything is ready to go. There is vodka, and there is a snack. Inventory prepared. General Secretary. The team is blessed. Gave CC, and drove off, leaving us 5 bags. Great icons. Here is May 15th. And the weather is good. Calculation sits underground. Here is the countdown. 10, 9, 8, 7. Everyone is completely hidden. Eni, Beni, Pestipoma. The lifting contact has arrived. Everyone was looking at the monitor. Will it go over the hill? But she did not disappoint. And go, go, go. We let go, we let go. Our fingers are tired. Between the first and second. Small break. That's been many years. The USSR was blown away by the wind. Our illustrious Buren turned into a restaurant. The tester sees a dream. He's back on the pitch. He sees the old landscape. There, behind the booth behind VAISHNA. As you can see, a little to the left. MIC without windows, without doors. There is no noise, no light. There, in the coffin, is your rocket. To fly here, Buren. It is necessary that all capitalist countries. We were interested. Do you agree with me? Yes. And after in February 1992 there was a riot in the construction troops, the situation became completely disastrous. Mazuta, as the soldiers of the construction battalion were called at Baikonur, was the first of the military to feel all the delights of the confusion of the command of the cosmodrome. The living conditions of military builders became simply nightmarish. The fighters in the barracks forgot about bed linen, a bath. And even in cold weather, servicemen had to wash themselves in the street with ice water. The food was generally disgusting, and even that food was not enough. As military builders complained to journalists, sometimes meat and fish were with worms. Well, why not Battleship Potemkin? The explosion was not long in coming. On the eve of the day of the Soviet Army, the Watch Military Commandant's office at the 118th site began firing at the soldiers who began to storm the guardhouse in order to free their detained colleagues. This was the detonator of very serious events. Military builders rebelled. They burned the barracks, plundered the food warehouse, robbed the army cash register, seized the KAMAZ trucks and moved towards the city of Leninsk. Fortunately, the soldiers decided not to storm the administrative center of the space harbor, but to go home. Therefore, they headed to the suburban station Tyuratam. There, on the forecourt, where the leadership of the city and the construction parts of the cosmodrome arrived, a rally went on all day. Moreover, once a rather hot, but peaceful rally almost turned into riots. The fact that some police officer did not come up with anything better than to send a police UAZ to the station square, the crowd immediately rushed to the car and tried to turn it over. And only thanks to the admonitions of the exacals of the suburban settlement, the tragedy was avoided. Only in the evening, with great difficulty, was it possible to persuade the military builders to go for the night to one of the military units of the construction headquarters. By the way, the construction battalion workers would not have been able to leave Baikonur anyway. According to a special directive, all trains, even freight trains, flew over the Tyuratam station for 2 days without stopping. Only in the evening, with great difficulty, was it possible to persuade the military builders to go for the night to one of the military units of the construction headquarters. By the way, the construction battalion workers would not have been able to leave Baikonur anyway. According to a special directive, all trains, even freight trains, flew over the Tyuratam station for 2 days without stopping. Only in the evening, with great difficulty, was it possible to persuade the military builders to go for the night to one of the military units of the construction headquarters. By the way, the construction battalion workers would not have been able to leave Baikonur anyway. According to a special directive, all trains, even freight trains, flew over the Tyuratam station for 2 days without stopping. During this terrible incident, the city lived exclusively by rumors. Because the local television gave out a message only that a small incident had occurred in several military units near the city of Leninsk. There was even talk of a curfew, which, fortunately, didn't happen. The Baikonur authorities, both military and civilian, showed a complete inability to cope with the conflict situation. All the persuasion of the soldiers to return to their units was not successful. And away from Sin, they were all sent home. Officially on vacation. But few returned from this so-called vacation. Those who did not return were left alone. And this moment came sideways twice more. Exactly a year later, on the 95th site, where the specialists who prepared and launched the proton rockets lived, a group of Russian rocket soldiers rebelled. Approximately 80 people tried to leave the unit on a motor train, a special passenger train on which specialists get from the city to their place of work. After the attempt was thwarted, about 20 servicemen seized the Kamaz and fled in it into the steppe. The reason for the dissatisfaction of the soldiers was the fact that the units were understaffed, because of which the soldiers had to work hard for 3. Fortunately, this time there were no shootings, arson or robberies. But in the summer of 2003, military builders from the unit, which was stationed literally 1.5 kilometers from the city, caused damage of 100 million rubles of that time with their rebellion. To quell the riots, the officers had to fire into the air. But one soldier was still wounded from a pistol. It is noteworthy that the reason for this performance of the soldiers was the rumors that the cosmodrome would soon be closed, and they would be sent to serve in Siberia. And last year's example of their colleagues inspired the construction battalion workers to revolt. The soldiers frankly said that they hoped for an early transfer to the reserve. Such sentiments among the fighters were by no means conducive to the precise implementation of space programs. Soldiers shied away from work in every possible way. It got to the point that in the assembly and test building of Site 95, due to an unknown fire that broke out, the satellite preparing for flight was completely burned out. Further hardships and misfortunes came to Baikonur from the new government. Unrest in the construction units led to almost a catastrophe. The construction officers began to hastily leave the cosmodrome along with their families. But the entire space harbor, including the city of Leninsk, was erected by military builders. And there were a lot of them at the spaceport. To be honest, the departure of military builders from Baikonur was more like a stampede. Many, without waiting for free containers to appear, abandoned all their belongings and left light. As a result of such an outcome of a large part of the inhabitants of the city of Leninsk, a lot of abandoned apartments appeared in the capital of the cosmodrome. And, as you know, the world does not tolerate emptiness. And residents of the surrounding villages began to move into these apartments. And I must say that by that time the Kazakh administration had come to power in the city. She immediately began to legitimize the residence of self-settlers, practically making a closed secret city open. I want to emphasize that this was not the policy of the government of Kazakhstan, but only the ambitions of one official. The show-offs of the newly made mayor, who decided to rule in the city alone, removing the military leadership of the cosmodrome from management, noticeably worsened the already difficult life of Baikonur residents. I will not name this figure out of principle. The people of Baikonur themselves know who they are talking about, and for other readers, let him remain one of the many bureaucrats who did not at all contribute to improving the life of the people. It should be especially noted that from the very foundation of the city in Leninsk, absolutely the entire urban economy was serviced by the military. Even the streets were swept by soldiers in the morning. The new head of the city decided overnight to take matters into his own hands. As a result, the collapse began in all areas of the life support of the city. No wonder that at the same time in the former quietest city in the region rampant crime began. After all, by no means the most law-abiding people came to the city from the surrounding villages. And the head of the administration, instead of fighting bad citizens, started a fight for the leadership of the Kazakh police. There were even attempts to evict the Russian police from the building, which for many years occupied the first police station in Leninsk, and to ban the activities of the Russian traffic police. Although, it would seem, it was necessary to involve law enforcement agencies and Russia and Kazakhstan to fight for the peaceful life of the citizens. After all, it was possible to get in the faces or be robbed in a closed city, even in broad daylight. Meanwhile, at the beginning there was not even a direct telephone connection between the Kazakh police and the Russian police of Baikonur. No wonder that in the early 90s life did not seem like honey to ordinary citizens. The command of the cosmodrome even had to issue a special leaflet addressing Baikonur residents, in which rather diplomatically, but severely described the truth of life. I am quoting this post in its entirety. In difficult conditions, we carry out tasks with you. The collapse of the USSR, the economic chaos and devastation that followed it, political instability, the crisis of national relations, inconsistency in resolving issues of military development and military service, all these are characteristic signs of the present day. In this regard, the Baikonur Cosmodrome, the glory and pride of the people, is going through hard times today. The conditions for fulfilling the tasks of spacecraft launches have noticeably become more complicated, and there are serious problems in logistical support. Social conditions deteriorated sharply, and, above all, the supply of the city and military units with food and industrial goods. All this is exacerbated by the unfavorable environmental situation, severe climatic conditions, constant interruptions in water and energy supply caused by the deterioration of communications. But despite all the difficulties, the city and the cosmodrome continue to live and produce space launches. Military personnel, workers and employees of the cosmodrome, residents of the city of Leninsk, overcoming difficult living conditions, sometimes working for 2 or 3, show truly heroism, multiply the traditions of the cosmodrome. Under these conditions, the command of the military space forces and the cosmodrome concentrated its main efforts on providing the military personnel and residents of the city, first of all, with food and essential goods. The tasks of providing water, electricity, bread are being solved. In this difficult situation, as always, extremist elements make themselves felt, spreading various kinds of rumors, gossip and fables among the residents of the city, the military personnel of the cosmodrome, which willy-nilly give rise to uncertainty and confusion. They take advantage of the difficulties of military service, provoke some servicemen to disobedience and illegal actions. At the same time, they do not think about the possible consequences. Veterans of the cosmodrome, those who have been living and working in the city of Leninsk for a long time, know that all this affects the disruption of the rhythm of life support. The result may be the emergence of panic among people. We believe that Baikonur will live and urge you to honestly fulfill your civil and military duty. Let me break this down a bit. The issue of ensuring the life of the city in those years was so acute that there was not even cold water in the children's clinic. Because water was supplied to medical institutions, as well as throughout the city, according to the schedule. And the amount that the medical staff managed to gain was only enough to wash their hands. There was no question of processing the instrumentation. But what can I say, when instead of the maternity ward, which was closed back in 1991, at the local hospital in the same medical institution, an obstetric service was opened, which was located on the 5th floor of the surgical ward, where neither hot nor cold water came. The toilets were inactive and there was no heating. And water for hygienic needs was in metal tanks standing along the corridor. Not surprising that Baikonur women preferred to give birth in their small homeland. By the way, since the formation of Baikonur, all the babies of the cosmodrome were born in a military hospital. A separate maternity ward in Leninsk appeared only at the beginning of this century, but the new father of the city, overflowing with his own significance, all this seemed not enough. Not only did the policy of the city authorities lead to a catastrophic shortage of bread in Leninsk, but literally on the eve of the winter of 1993-94, the administration also decided to take the city's thermal power plant from the military. At the same time, having neither the money to repair the worn-out heat and water communications, nor the appropriate structure and specialists. Moreover, the transfer of the city CHP began in October, almost on the eve of the heating season. It should be especially noted that the transfer of such an object from the military to civilians in general was the first case in recent history. The city leader should think 100 times before deciding to take such a step. But ambition outweighed any common sense. As a result, the city survived the winter in much the same way like besieged Leningrad. Regular interruptions in electricity, gas, lack of heating. The city began to resemble a settlement under a state of siege, empty shop counters, torn sidewalks and roads everywhere, empty eye sockets of windows in abandoned apartments, pipes of bourgeois stoves protrude from other windows. Baikonur survived only thanks to their amazing ingenuity. Tell me, who could have thought of heating a brick on a gas stove, when there was gas, and putting it on a baking sheet in a warming room? Or use a bucket of hot water placed next to the bed for heating? The wealthiest citizens set up tourist tents in the room and slept in them with the whole family. Unfortunately, from the fires that were not uncommon at that time, the inhabitants of the city died. One of the outstanding residents of Baikonur, the permanent captain of the KVN team, Golden Bionok, Sasha Alexandrov, also died in the fire that arose because of an overturned candle. The inhabitants of the space harbor died, falling into hot water pits, getting on cars into excavated roads, from frostbite. In the same winter, the main temple of culture, the garrison house of officers, burned down, 2 bakeries in the city stopped working, and the meat processing plant closed. The city was in danger of starvation. At this time, the people of Baikonur fully appreciated the food rations that were given out to military personnel. The people were also saved by enterprising people from neighboring district centers who brought bread, meat and other food products. Rescuers sold food for a lot of extra money throughout the city, sometimes right from the ground. and the inhabitants of Leninsk willingly bought food, albeit of dubious quality. Few people thought about sanitation at that time. The optimism of Baikonur residents was not increased by the monetary reform in Russia, when in the summer of 1993 this country introduced new rubles into circulation. Old Soviet banknotes immediately depreciated. Their purchasing power fell by half, and the inhabitants of the space harbor, including the Russian military, continued to be paid salaries by Soviet candy wrappers. Officers even had to massively refuse to receive salaries in old money in order to defend their rights to a normal life. In a word, the situation has developed such that a mass departure of specialists has begun. And those who remain tried to send their children to study in Russia or other cities of Kazakhstan. It got to the point that in one of the secondary schools in the city, by the graduation party, only 7 students were recruited. The mass departure also led to the theft of plumbing and gas appliances from empty apartments. And this led to a terrible tragedy, a gas explosion in a 5-story building. The whole entrance of the high-rise building collapsed. 16 people died. Subsequently, the emergency house was demolished, and a monument to the dead was erected in its place. It is not surprising that skeptics began to prophesy the imminent death of the Baikonur Cosmodrome. But, despite all the problems, the people of Baikonur never lost their presence of mind and hope for a better future. Here is a characteristic letter to the Baikonur newspaper from one of the residents, published in August 1993 under the heading, "Cry from the Soul." "You are one of my favorite cities in my life. This is where my family was born and raised. My children were born and live. You have been given the best years of your life. Even today we give all our strength to support your fading breath. You are dying before our eyes, artificial rivers on the streets are like broken blood vessels in your body. Dried trees, the deepest dermatitis of your skin. The empty eye sockets of the windows are the empty look of an indifferent person doomed to death. Mountains of garbage with a terrifying smell, festering wounds on your body. I'm scared for you. I think that only the people who inhabit you keep you breathing. But people are leaving you and it's getting harder to breathe every day. Why were you abandoned and left without attention? Where are you, sorcerer doctor? Rise to your feet, save our beloved child. I want him to breathe deeper, so that light appears in his eyes, so that, as before, my beloved city is cheerful and laughing. To overcome life's difficulties, the Earthnauts, as the press pompously called the Baikonur residents, were helped by their inherent humor and belief that better times would still come. This is how the musicians of the metal scrap group reflected that period in their song. Leninists live in the city of Leninsk. With the name of Lenin, lie down and get up. Leninists are mothers, Leninists are fathers. Their children are also Leninists. Leninists live in the city of Leninsk. Glorious traditions sacredly cherish. They say that the great leader himself bequeathed to us. So call the space birth. Leninsk lived, Leninsk is alive, Leninsk will live forever. And what will become of him with such a name? Leninists live in the city of Leninsk. People often drink to Lenin's health. They go to the monument to Lenin and shout. We will not let Illich be offended. Leninists live in the city of Leninsk. And the name of the city is very honored. Baikonur is not necessary to them. Zvezdograd, down with it. Leninsk is more than a saint for them. Leninsk lived, Leninsk is alive, Leninsk will live forever. And what will become of him with such a name? Leninists live in the city of Leninsk. The bright future is patiently waiting. Classics are read by candlelight. In the cold, without light and water. Leninists live in the city of Leninsk. Everything they have is Leninist, both love and work. If the husbands are away, or there are no wives. The schedule is extremely tight. Leninsk lived, Leninsk is alive, Leninsk will live forever. And what will become of him with such a name? The Leninists are fleeing from the city of Leninsk. Modest Leninist containers are being transported, and in the hallways abandoned, it can be seen in a rush. They break Illich's lamps. Leninists no longer live in the city. Lonely winds sweep the streets. Someone friendly slap on the shoulder. Monument to native Illich. Leninsk lived, Leninsk is alive, Leninsk will live forever. And what will happen to him with such a name? Leninsk lived, Leninsk is alive, Leninsk will live forever. And if you don't like it, go to hell. One of the few who still believed in the possibility of Baikonur's revival were veterans of the Cosmodrome. They addressed an open letter to the President of Kazakhstan. In their appeal, the veterans asked for immediate assistance to the city, which is dying before our eyes. In particular, veterans wrote, "The situation of the population is disastrous. Systems of energy, heat, water supply, sewerage and telephone communications are worn out. No funds or materials are allocated to maintain them in proper condition. It is cold in the apartments of residents, drinking water is supplied intermittently, and electricity is often cut off for a long time. Not a single kindergarten, not a single school can work normally in such conditions. The trading network is broken. We are literally hungry for food and manufactured goods. Even in the provision of bread there are frequent interruptions. A mode of self-survival has been set for the inhabitants of the city. We are all anxious and ask a direct question: does anyone need the Baikonur Cosmodrome?" Unprecedented rental in history became the salvation of a global brand. The leadership of Kazakhstan responded to the veterans of Baikonur not with some promises, but with real actions. To save the very first and largest cosmodrome in the world, the only right decision was made by the presidents of the two countries, Nursultan Nazarbayev of Kazakhstan and Boris Yeltsin of Russia, to lease the space complex to the Russian Federation for a period of 20 years. One can easily understand with what enthusiasm in March 1994 the inhabitants of the space harbor greeted the news of this decision. It should be especially noted that such an experience, when one state leases to another not just a territory literally in the center of the country, but a whole space complex, has never been in the history of mankind. Incidentally, this is not the case today. There was a lot of controversy over some decisions of the signed lease agreement. And here it is impossible to ignore the solid pig, which was planted on Baikonur by a high-ranking Kazakh official G. Abilsatov. The fact is that the lease agreement was developed by a joint Kazakh-Russian commission within 6 months. It will be enough to say about the competence of that commission that from the Kazakh side it was headed by the first Kazakh cosmonaut, head of the National Aerospace Agency of the Republic of Kazakhstan Tokhtar Orbakirov. But just before the signing of the documents by the heads of the two states, in some incomprehensible way, the lease agreement fell into the hands of Abilsatov. And as he later boasted, "I literally rewrote the entire document in 2 hours." As a result, the document turned out to be so raw that Nursultan Nazarbayev had to make changes and additions to the treaty with his own hand immediately before signing it. In particular, in the column, "Payment of Rent," Nursultan Abishevich added in the line about the amount of the payment, annually, that Nursultan Nazarbayev had to make changes and additions to the treaty with his own hand immediately before its signing. In particular, in the column, "Payment of Rent," Nursultan Abishevich added in the line about the amount of the payment, annually, that Nursultan Nazarbayev had to make changes and additions to the treaty with his own hand immediately before its signing. In particular, in the column, "Payment of Rent," Nursultan Abishevich added in the line about the amount of the payment, annually. Despite the fact that the lease agreement was signed in March 1994, it was ratified only in the fall. The Russian head of administration was appointed only at the end of December. Until then, the ambitious Kazakh mayor continued to command the city, who managed to once again show his disregard for the problems of the townspeople. The government of Kazakhstan, knowing about the plight of the people of Baikonur in terms of providing food, allocated 50 million tenge, at the exchange rate of that time, $1 million, for the purchase of food. Mr. Mayor, through a trading company at the city administration, quietly scrolled this money in his favor for almost half a year in the banks of the Baltic states. And this was at a time when there was simply no bread in Leninsk. And the investigators of the city prosecutor's office, which conducted an investigation at the request of deputies of the city Maslikat, documents were presented stating that the money was used to purchase Belgian ice cream. And when the customer was allegedly not satisfied with the quality of the ice cream, the contract with the Belgian company was terminated. After that, the money was sent to buy Dutch cheeses and chocolates. The prosecutor's office just shrugged it off. "You can't argue with the documents, this product falls under the concept of food." And that was the limit of bureaucratic cynicism. But, according to some direct participants in this scam, who were not afraid of frankness, the project was brilliant, to make money from nothing. And, of course, no one was punished. After that, the money was sent to buy Dutch cheeses and chocolates. The prosecutor's office just shrugged it off. "You can't argue with the documents, this product falls under the concept of food." And that was the limit of bureaucratic cynicism. But, according to some direct participants in this scam, who were not afraid of frankness, the project was brilliant, to make money from nothing. And, of course, no one was punished. After that, the money was sent to buy Dutch cheeses and chocolates. The prosecutor's office just shrugged it off. You can't argue with the documents, this product falls under the concept of food. And that was the limit of bureaucratic cynicism. But, according to some direct participants in this scam, who were not afraid of frankness, the project was brilliant, to make money from nothing. And, of course, no one was punished. I would like to say a few words about the Maslakat of the city of Leninsk. Having existed for less than a year, the body of local representative power, naturally, did not manage to do much to improve the life of Baikina residents. But Maslakat entered the history of the city. Suffice it to say that, according to his decision, the deputy head of the administration for economics was fired, and an investigation began on a $1 million loan. And at the end of 1994, the Maslakat dissolved itself due to the fact that the space complex was leased to the Russian Federation. But just before the dissolution, the deputies of the Lenin Maslakat, at the suggestion of the new, already Russian, head of administration Gennady Dmitrienko, adopted a resolution on a petition to the president of Kazakhstan to rename the city of Leninsk to the city of Baikina. Thus, the first Maslakat of Leninsk became the last in its history. Because, even if in the distant future a new Maslakat appears in the administrative center of the space harbor, it will already be the Maslakat of the city of Baikina. When there is desire in power, then prosperity is possible. The revival of the city and the cosmodrome is by no means accidentally associated with the name of the first Russian mayor of Baikina, Gennady Dmitrievich Dmitrienko. By the way, the mayor of the capital of the cosmodrome is the only one in the world who is appointed by decree of the presidents of two states at once, Russia and Kazakhstan. The Russian mayor, who lived at the cosmodrome most of his life, having served from lieutenant to colonel, knew all the problems of city life literally from the inside. And most importantly, Gennady Dmitrienko loved his city. It is not surprising that Gennady Dmitrievich first of all took up the restoration of the destroyed urban economy, began to establish a normal life for the townspeople. Old-timers remember how difficult it was. The signed lease agreements have not yet come into operation. The new mayor had to literally beg for money for life support from both the Russian and Kazakh authorities. At the same time, we had to deal with a split in urban society which consisted of citizens of Kazakhstan and Russia. Frankly, after the incompetent adventurist rule of the Kazakhstani head of the city administration, some officials of the Russian mayor's office tried to show in whose hands the power is now. And ordinary residents of Baikina suffered again. There was even a time when citizens of the Republic of Kazakhstan who committed crimes in the city were tried by a Russian military court. Despite the fact that the Kazakh police, the prosecutor's office, and the court were in the city. And when the Kazakh government in the late 90s of the last century decided to temporarily ban the import of food from abroad, they again forgot about the special status of Baikina. Russian soldiers serving at the cosmodrome were almost left without food. It got to the point that even children in schools began to be divided according to citizenship, when Russian citizens were given hot meals, and Kazakhstanis were only supposed to have a cookie with butter. Despite the fact that the Russian side paid for school breakfasts, Gennady Dmitrienko, at his own peril and risk, ordered all children to be fed, regardless of citizenship. Then he got for it, on the nuts, from the higher authorities. All this was the result of the signing of the raw lease agreement, which created many problems in its implementation at the spaceport. More than 100 additional agreements had to be accepted for it. And, as experts say, this is not the limit. By the way, it was the first Russian mayor of Baikina who began to consider all residents of the city, regardless of citizenship, as Baikina residents. Because any resident of our city, even janitors, work to carry out space programs, the main task of the Baikina complex, said Gennady Dmitrievich. And his proposal to give all residents of the city a special status, citizen of Baikina, which would automatically remove many social issues, was voiced more than once at meetings of commissions of various levels. We have already developed so much of our own know-how in solving many issues related to the different citizenships of our residents that Baikina can safely claim the role of the capital of the CIS, the mayor of the city once said either jokingly or seriously. Unfortunately, this idea remained only a dream of Gennady Dmitrienko. And from the very beginning, the new mayor had plenty of work. In order to find funds for the restoration of the city, the new mayor had to practically spend months on an airplane between Baikina and Moscow. Sometimes I had to disregard the laws. The mayor of the city did not hide even from journalists that considerable sums had to be spent on kickbacks to officials in order to knock out the necessary equipment or materials. But thanks to the efforts of Gennady Dmitrienko, after a couple of years, the city with the new name Baikonur noticeably lived. And those who have not been at the spaceport after the dark years, for at least a few years, the city was generally recognized with difficulty. It has changed so much for the better. Many dilapidated houses were repaired. In the remaining unclaimed buildings, window openings and doors were laid with bricks. It was possible to restore city roads. Old squares were restored, new ones began to appear. It was even possible to revive the central city park, named after culture and recreation. It is quite understandable that such an attitude towards the city could not but arouse sympathy for the first Russian mayor of Baikonur. Not surprisingly, the inhabitants of the space harbor respectfully called him Uncle Gina among themselves. Unfortunately, problems in the life support of the city arose again after the default that happened in Russia in 1998. At that time, they were not able to purchase fuel oil for the city's thermal power plant in sufficient quantities. Gennady Dmitrienko found an unusual way out of this situation. He created an offshore zone at Baikonur for Russian oil companies and brought the city out of the crisis. Moreover, tax revenues from offshore allowed for the first time in 10 years to repair very long roads at the spaceport itself. It was not only scary to drive along these roads because of the pits and potholes, but also terribly uncomfortable in front of foreign guests. There was even a case when the British offered not to pay money for the flight of their non-professional cosmonaut Helen Sharman, but to make a road from the city to the Gagarin start. But then in 1992, generals from the Russian Ministry of Defense assured the British that they are being transported along an emergency road, since the main one is closed for repairs. The real renovation was done only after 8 years. But some of the Russian government officials did not like this independence of the mayor. Still, he stopped going to bow to them with considerable kickbacks. And a scandalous epic began in the press about illegal offshore companies. But Gennady Dmitrienko, fighting off annoying reporters and various inspectors, continued to improve and develop the city. Until he was fired in 2002. But Baikonur residents remember to whom they owe the current state of their beloved city. It is no coincidence that in 2005 the current city authorities awarded Gennady Dmitrievich Dmitrienko the title of Honorary Citizen of Baikonur. Long night Karenia resulted in lyrical digressions. Let bananas and coconuts not grow in the steppe, but there is a railway here, into space. Trains in these parts ran from east to west and from west to east, and on the sides of the railway in these parts lay the great desert spaces, Seryozaki, the middle lands of the yellow steppes. In these regions, any distances were measured in relation to the railway, as from the Greenwich meridian, and the trains went from east to west and from west to east. These lines from Chingiz Akhmetov's novel, Stormy Stop, briefly but very succinctly describe most of the Orenburg-Tashkent Railway, which in 2004 turned exactly 100 years old. Such was the Tyuratam junction until January 12, 1955, when the first landing of builders arrived at this junction, who were to begin the construction of the very first cosmodrome in the world. Within a week, after the landing of the first builders of the future cosmodrome, endless echelons with equipment and labor from all over the Soviet Union began to arrive by the Orenburg-Tashkent Railway to the Tyuratam station. Later, both rockets for launching satellites and the spacecraft themselves began to be delivered by rail. In order for the very first cosmodrome in the world to be built at an accelerated pace and operate normally, several hundred kilometers of its own railway lines were laid across the territory of the space complex, inextricably linked with the Orenburg-Tashkent highway. And until now, absolutely all spacecraft plow the expanses of the Baikonur steppes exclusively with the help of rail transport. Space equipment is not only delivered to the Baikonur facilities in special wagons, but also moved around the cosmodrome during the necessary preparation and refueling operations, up to being transported to the launch complex exclusively by rail. Many poems and songs at the Baikonur Cosmodrome are dedicated to special Baikonur trains, on which most specialists are delivered daily to their place of work at the Cosmodrome. And all combat crews, before launching any rocket, also go to the launch complexes on these trains. It is interesting that these passenger trains at the Cosmodrome were called motor locomotives. But why? No one can explain so far. But the locomotives themselves have become one of the main attractions of Baikonur, along with rockets and launch complexes. Despite the fact that military railroad workers carried out rail transport at the Cosmodrome for a long time, the most important cargoes were delivered to the launch facilities by the most experienced machinists from the depot of the neighboring Kazalinsk station. The diesel locomotives themselves also underwent maintenance there, And until now, for the majority of the inhabitants of the space harbor, the railway is an important link with most cities in Kazakhstan, Russia, and the CIS countries. Every Baikonur citizen used to be able to buy a bottle in the store, Mesdu Nog. Baikonur residents have always been distinguished by a wonderful sense of humor and the ability to give an apt name to their city sites. As soon as a monument was erected at the entrance to the city, which depicted the unity of the people who worked in different sectors of the national economy, below, miners leaving the face, then a stele that turns into the first artificial satellite of the Earth, Baikonur residents immediately determined the name of the monument, From the Cave to Space. The first micro-district on the outskirts of the city was built in the early 70s, when the Chinese attacked Damansky Island. And immediately the area between the streets of the world and Sifalin was named exactly like that. This unofficial name has survived to this day. The very first micro-district, built at the other end of the city simultaneously with the release of the brilliant book of General Secretary Brezhnev, was called Small Land by the Baikonurites. And the residential area, which was built on the outskirts of the city, the official name is the 7th micro-district, was called the Japanese Islands. In Soviet times, not a single city of the Soviet Union could do without the presence of huge letters CPSU. This fashion did not bypass Baikonur either. True, the main communists of the city covered with huge letters a no less large wasteland at the entrance to the city. But, by coincidence, on Sifalin Street, the turn to which the party symbol immortalized, a glass store was built that sold alcohol. And the people of Baikonur instantly deciphered the inscription of the CPSU in their own way: whoever has a hangover, a piece of glass on the right. The 3-story building on the current Arbet, which today houses the editorial office of the city newspaper Baikonur, has always been in the spotlight. Because there was a women's shoe store on the right, and a men's shoe store on the left. And in the middle was a shop that sold wine. And the inhabitants of the city nicknamed this wine shop, Between the Legs. The only people in Baikonur who called this outlet by its true name were the football players who organized an unofficial championship called the 5th Delhi Championship, at the school stadium, located just behind the store. When a contented gloomy building of a shopping center was built on Yangjel Street, the people immediately dubbed it Bastille. Perhaps today, few residents of the city remember why the supermarket in the 5th micro-district is called Blue. No, this name has nothing to do with the sexual orientation of anyone. It's just that by the time this store opened, it was completely painted blue on the outside. And since at that time there was already one supermarket in Leninsk, in order not to confuse these outlets, the people of Baikonur gave their name to the new store. And in the city of Leninsk there was a unique supermarket. On the 3rd floor there was a Ruslan men's clothing store, on the 2nd floor there was a Ludmila women's clothing store, and on the 1st floor there was a pharmacy. It is quite clear that Dior models were not sold there. Nevertheless, Baikonur residents regularly visited this outlet. And they vented their disappointment in such a humorous form. Why has Ruslan been lying on Ludmila for so many years, but they still don't have children? Don't you know that there is a pharmacy on the 1st floor? The quality of service for the residents of Leninsk by shuttle buses was assessed very low by the Baikonur residents themselves. The old, unpresentable liaisons were nicknamed livestock trucks. Let me remind you that Soviet architects expressed their respect for the leader of the world proletariat in a rather original way. In almost all cities of the USSR, a monument to Lenin pointed to a restaurant with his hand. The city named after Illich was no exception. The monument standing on the square of its name extended its hand strictly in the direction of the central restaurant, the only one in Leninsk at that time. By the way, in Kizilorda, the regional center on the territory of which Baikonur is located, there was a more interesting composition. There, in the very heart of the central park of the city, they created a composition of 3 prominent Bolsheviks at once: Budyonny with a mustache and a saber, Voroshilov with binoculars, and Lenin with an outstretched hand. This composition gave rise to a whole legend. Like, Budyonny asks his comrades, "Guys, where can you drink here?" Voroshilov says, "Now, wait, I'll look through binoculars." And Lenin notices with a grin, indicating the direction with his hand, "What is there to see?" Here it is, the restaurant, summer. Even the places of residence of Baikonur residents received sonorous names. To put it mildly, the residential town created in the 70s of the last century for Donetsk miners from primitive residential trailers at the former Stroitel Stadium, and this happened immediately after the Pinochet junta came to power in Chile. The residents themselves called it Santiago Stadium. This concentration of trailers under this name existed in the city almost until the end of the 20th century. And the most famous was the nickname Buchenwald. This name was awarded to the dormitory on Site 113, in which specialists who arrived in Baikonur on long business trips lived. For the appropriate living conditions in this hostel, the guests compared it with the infamous fascist concentration camp. Drink, man, rocket juice, you will be strong and tall. The most common joke among the Baikonur military has always been one phrase, well, I drank a liter of alcohol, well, too. But why get drunk? From the very foundation of the Baikonur Cosmodrome, a strict, dry law has been in force here. But people who worked not only in the strictest secrecy, but also in the most difficult climatic and physical conditions, needed detent. And our man knows only one way to relax, a good drink. And, starting from the pioneers who started the construction of the first space harbor of mankind, the Baikonur specialists managed to find a way to get the necessary firewater. And, given that at that time alcohol was used immeasurably at the spaceport, it was native and became the main object of consumption. Since C2H5OH was mainly used in rocket technology, the people of Baikonur began to call alcohol rocket juice. There is such a tale about those ancient times at the Cosmodrome. At the chief designer of rocket technology, Sergei Pavlovich Korolev, all filming was carried out by a frontline cameraman who worked after the war in the Centenuch film studio. It is known that all the filming equipment at that time was quite cumbersome, and for its maintenance it was necessary to involve many specialists. And then one Saturday, when there was nothing to shoot, the cameraman said to his assistants, "Shouldn't we have a drink, friends?" In response, of course, he heard, they say, "It's a sin to laugh at sick people, because the dry law." But the main instigator of the idea to drink instead of a showdown simply took a huge sheet of scribbled paper, according to which the amount of alcohol needed to wipe the lenses of movie cameras, lighting spotlights, etc. was calculated, and began to make calculations. When the operator finished his work, it turned out that 13 kilograms 230 grams of the coveted liquid were needed for the prevention of filming equipment. But the colonel, who commanded the test center where the filmmakers lived, seeing how much alcohol needed to be given out, immediately declared, "Only the head of the Cosmodrome can allocate such an amount." Our hero did not lose his head here either, but asked the colonel for a car to go to the headquarters, and it was 32 kilometers before him. The commander did not dare to refuse the personal operator of the Queen himself. Having entered the office of the head of the Cosmodrome, the master documentary maker stated his request for the allocation of alcohol. The general raised his eyebrows in surprise. "Why so many?" To which an immediate response followed, "And how many people?" They say that the head of the Cosmodrome burst out laughing and ordered to give out rocket juice. That for the prevention of filming equipment, 13 kilograms 230 grams of the coveted liquid are needed. But the colonel, who commanded the test center where the filmmakers lived, seeing how much alcohol needed to be given out, immediately declared, "Only the head of the Cosmodrome can allocate such an amount." Our hero did not lose his head here either, but asked the colonel for a car to go to the headquarters, and it was 32 kilometers before him. The commander did not dare to refuse the personal operator of the Queen himself. Having entered the office of the head of the Cosmodrome, the master documentary maker stated his request for the allocation of alcohol. The general raised his eyebrows in surprise. "Why so many?" To which an immediate response followed, "And how many people?" They say that the head of the Cosmodrome burst out laughing and ordered to give out rocket juice. That for the prevention of filming equipment, 13 kilograms 230 grams of the coveted liquid are needed. But the colonel, who commanded the test center where the filmmakers lived, seeing how much alcohol needed to be given out, immediately declared, "Only the head of the Cosmodrome can allocate such an amount." Our hero did not lose his head here either, but asked the colonel for a car to go to the headquarters, and it was 32 kilometers before him. The commander did not dare to refuse the personal operator of the Queen himself. Having entered the office of the head of the Cosmodrome, the master documentary maker stated his request for the allocation of alcohol. The general raised his eyebrows in surprise. "Why so many?" To which an immediate response followed, "And how many people?" They say that the head of the Cosmodrome burst out laughing and ordered to give out rocket juice. But the heyday of the consumption of alcohol not, for its intended purpose, fell on the years of Brezhnev's rule. Then the alcohol flowed like a river. And, in the most natural sense. For example, pressure chambers before testing spacecraft in them in order to create sterile cleanliness were simply poured with alcohol from buckets. And in this situation, writing off 20 to 30 liters to the left at a time was a trifling matter. Yes, no one really checked. This led to other curiosities. For example, on one of the sites where military satellites were being prepared for launch, conscripts began to regularly come across who arranged chic feasts with alcohol at night. Father's commanders puzzled for a long time where the fighters find 2-5 he followed them around the clock. It seems that no one passed them anything, all day in front of their eyes. And at night, the old people, all without exception, get drunk. When they managed to solve this riddle, the commanders were simply amazed at the resourcefulness of the rocket juice lovers. It turned out that the fighters were not too lazy to dig a huge hole next to the pressure chamber, put a huge barrel on the bottom, covered it with several layers of various materials, building something like a multi-layer filter. And from above, all this was neatly disguised with turf. And when the pressure chamber was washed with alcohol, the coveted liquid not only poured onto the ground, but, passing through a kind of cleaning, filled the prepared container. And in order to use the fruit of their ingenuity, the soldiers attached a crane to the bottom of the barrel and led a disguised hole to the rocket juice warehouse they had created. Meanwhile, one of the main reasons for the strong sex of the Cosmodrome's addiction to rocket juice was not so much its availability, but rather the lack of ordinary vodka on sale in city stores. Until the beginning of the 80s of the last century, only dry wines were sold in the city of Leninsk. Basically, the red ones are Cabernet and Bear Blood. What women really liked. But the male population of Baikonur strongly hated the military command of the Cosmodrome for this. People didn't call red wine anything other than Sergunin, by the name of the head of the Cosmodrome, General Sergunin, and once the Baikonur residents anonymously sent a whole parcel of red wine, Bear Blood, as a gift to the head of the test site. There was a note in the package, "Here, fill up." You could try cognac or vodka only in a restaurant or cafe. But it was tight with them in the city, with 100,000th population from the late 70s to the middle. In the 80s of the last century, only one restaurant worked in Leninsk, Central. And there was a small Café Moon, in the premises of which the evangelistic center is now located, and the Baikonur people began to gradually switch to vodka on their own. Fortunately, there were bootleggers in the suburban village of Tyuratam, at least fill up. And next to the main bazaar of Baikonur, which in those years was located on the site of today's bus station in Tyuratom, there was a private tavern of Uncle Sasha, famous in the 80s. This Uzbek entrepreneur always had fresh draft beer from the local Akai brewery, a lot of vodka and good kebabs on sale. It is not surprising that the vast majority of Baikonur specialists went out to the Prigorodnaya platform to mark the end of the working day, at Uncle Sasha's. And if there wasn't enough booze at night, during the celebrations in the city itself, then you had to go to Tyuratam to the grandmother's, where, only, for 7 rubles, at the state price of 3 rubles 62 kopecks, at the so-called points. By the way, draft beer of local production and in the city itself was bottled by the sea. Old-timers remember that the famous 800-liter yellow barrels with beer from the Akai brewery were brought to every yard every day. And the people could almost without queues to buy a cold drink. And the most popular container of that time were 3-liter glass jars. Alcohol is associated with another famous story throughout the Cosmodrome. Once, on a long flight to the Salyut orbital station, a crew started, which included a friend of one of the specialists who were preparing the spacecraft for flight. And this specialist, at the request of his astronaut friend, quietly pulled out of the spacecraft 3 kilograms of his personal belongings and instead of them put a heating pad with alcohol of the same weight. The cargo in the spacecraft is weighed to the nearest milligram. After arriving at the station, the crew accepted the space house from the previous shift of cosmonauts and escorted them to Earth. And, somewhere, after a week of work in space, the new crew had a day off. And the cosmonauts had a good rest, apparently, because they did not get in touch with the control center for a day. Only the next morning they floated into the compartment where the camera is located and with a satisfied look asked, "Hello, have you probably lost us?" Scandal in a noble family, they say, was the strongest. And the unlucky space bootlegger who sent the alcohol package into orbit was calculated and fired with a wolf ticket. Of course, with a fairly massive consumption of rocket juice, people could not help but appear who would be famous for their enormous resistance to intoxication with 96-degree swill. At one time, in the city of Leninsk itself, a captain of enormous stature served, whom no one had ever seen sober. It was said that he alone could drink at least a liter of alcohol at a time and get home on his own. Veterans recall that once in the summer, at a general garrison divorce which was personally conducted by the head of the space harbor on the central square in front of the headquarters of the Cosmodrome, General Sergunin noticed that this officer was not quite firmly on his feet. A stern military leader approached him and asked sternly, "Comrade Captain, how can you drink in such a heat?" To which, not at a loss, the captain replied, "What, will you order me to wait for the winter?" In the early 80s, Pepsi Cola began to appear in the constant sale of Baikonur. People immediately figured out that this is an ideal component for a cocktail of alcohol. The cocktail even got its own name, Sputnik. Gorbachev's struggle with alcohol, and not with alcoholism, as planned, led to a noticeable deterioration in the quality of rocket juice. Its taste ceased to suit lovers of high-grade drink. Today, only some specialists drink alcohol, who arrived at the Cosmodrome on a long business trip from Russian cities and live on the sites of the Cosmodrome. And in most shops located in the city of Baikonur, vodka is sold freely today. We can say that the times of rocket juice have sunk into oblivion along with the bygone 20th century, and today the number of cozy establishments where you can have a pleasant evening has exceeded 30. I think I won't be mistaken if I say that the most popular among the people of Baikonur, yes, or to hide, among the cosmonauts, is the Cafe Hunting Lodge. Or, as it was called by the people, Gap. Many still do not know where this name came from. And the casket is easy to open. When the cafe was still only a small summer area, the entrance to it was a narrow passage in a long brick fence. Moreover, there was not even a sign. And the place of the meeting had to be somehow determined. And the people of Baikonur, who were much more inventive, gave their own name, the Slit. The owner of this cafe, Viktor Nikitin, guessed exactly what Baikonur people need, who want to spend the evening in a cozy atmosphere and have a delicious meal. The freshest beer, the best kebabs of various types in the city, fragrant oriental dishes from the Uzbek chef, cozy shady areas, all this immediately won the sympathy of the townspeople. Sometimes it got to the point that people stood in line, waiting for the tables to be vacated, and the waiters just knocked off their feet, but they didn't always have time. Even when the winter version of the Hunting Lodge was just being built, the owner of the cafe made another very accurate hit. He installed 2 yurts in the Letnik, one for 10 people, the second, for 40. Inside they were decorated in strict accordance with Kazakh customs and traditions. And yurts began to be considered a prestigious place for various banquets. The astronauts also fell in love with the yurts. Alexei Leonov, Valentina Tereshkova, Vasily Tsibliev, Talgat Musabayev and many others were quite frequent guests here. It is quite clear that foreign astronauts could not help but appreciate the national flavor. Once in the Slit, I quite by chance met the American astronaut Edward Lu, who, after his 6-month flight, came to Baikonur with his family. Ed admitted that it was the desire to taste delicious barbecue again that brought him to the Hunting Lodge, what he had dreamed of since last year's visit to this cafe. And this time, the American conqueror of near-Earth space was very pleased with what he managed to taste in the most popular vacation spot of the space harbor. Baikonur residents have no ambitions, they have enough of their own traditions. The whole life of the Earthnauts, as the Baikonur poets called it, is devoted to one thing, the exploration of outer space. And space for Baikonur has become a city-forming one. It is no wonder that a saying has long been formed at the Cosmodrome that here even a janitor works for space. And since everyone associated with astronautics is not without a little superstition, the traditions that were born as the space industry developed are gradually turning into unwritten laws. But until recently, only a few knew about these traditions. Ever since the time of Sergei Pavlovich Korolev, it has been established that, just in case, the main and backup crews fly to Baikonur from Star City in different planes. And this rule has never been broken. Even in the most difficult times for astronautics, when there was not enough money or fuel, the astronauts flew to the spaceport separately. And at Baikonur itself, cosmonauts carry out a lot of pre-launch traditions. From the very first cosmonauts of the planet, the traditional painting of the crew members on the door of the room in which they lived before the launch, the report to the chairman of the State Commission, the sending of small needs to the right rear wheel of the bus of the main crew before entering the Gagarin start, the photographs for memory, the steps of the elevator that takes the crew upstairs to the cabin of the spacecraft, and planting trees on a special astronaut's alley after returning from the flight. But over time, life added more and more rituals. Sometimes they were presented by life itself. For example, the tradition of watching the film, White Son of the Desert, on the eve of the start has been going on for more than 30 years. But it turned out that after the death of the crew consisting of Dobrovolsky, Volkov and Patsev during the return to Earth on June 30, 1971, the crew of Soyuz 12, which started next after the tragedy, cosmonauts Lazarev and Makarov watched the film that had just been released. White Son of Desert. The flight by this crew was completed successfully. The following crews also wished to be shown this film on the eve of the flight. All flights went well. As the head of the U.A. Gagarin Training Center, General Vasily Tsibliev, once joked, "I believe that anyone who has not watched The White Son of the Desert at least 5 times, not ready to go into space yet." Until now, every crew pays tribute to this tradition in the evening before the start. Moreover, over the past 30-plus years, the astronauts have come up with their own quiz in which they answer more than 100 questions about the film. The simplest of them sound, for example, like this: what was the name of Abdullah's third wife? After the appearance of the song of the group, Earthlings, and We Do Not Dream of the Roar of the Cosmodrome, this hit became a kind of anthem, under which the crews of astronauts leave the hotel to go to the spacecraft. In the late 80s of the last century, Oleg Urasov, who at that time was the director of the Museum of the Baikonur Cosmodrome, became the founder of another tradition, the obligatory visit of the cosmonauts to the museum after the first time off. During these trainings, they have to sit in a spaceship for several hours in a row. In the late 1990s, together with Reuters operator Shavkat Rakhmatullayev, with great difficulty, for the first time, I managed to persuade the space authorities to give an interview to journalists immediately after their release, when the cosmonauts were still in spacesuits. Thanks to the assistance of Vasily Tsibliev, at that time he was the deputy head of the Cosmonaut Training Center, the chief sanitary epidemiologist of Star City Sergei Savin, and the first vice president of RSC Energia Nikolai Zelenchikov, the go-ahead for the interview was received. And since then, an interview in the assembly and test building after the first fitting of the ship has also become a tradition. Also at the end of the last century, another significant moment appeared in pre-launch preparations. The backup crew always finds time to meet with the staff of the Department of Internal Affairs of the Baikonur complex, which ensure not only law and order at the Cosmodrome, but also protect the astronauts during their stay in the space harbor. The onset of the 21st century was marked by another tradition. The servants of the Baikonur Church of St. George the Victorious began to consecrate spaceships and crews before the flight. Muslims are admonished by the imam of the local mosque. By the way, the Holy Fathers also consecrate other spaceships, Progress, Protons and Zeniths. One remarkable episode is connected with this tradition. Once, when Proton was supposed to launch an American satellite into low Earth orbit, NASA representatives did not want to consecrate the ship and satellite. And what? The carrier rocket with the satellite was twice taken out to the launch complex and twice returned to the assembly and testing complex due to technical problems on the American spacecraft. And then experts from the United States remembered the priest. The head of the Baikonur Church consecrated a rocket with a satellite. And she started without problems. It is quite understandable that many are interested in the question, are there any traditions associated with the use? There is. And there are several. Of course, doubles have to take the rap. For the first time 12 days before the launch, during the fitting of spacesuits, while the main crew puts on spacesuits, the cosmonauts doubling them conduct training in the ship, and after freeing it for the work of the main crew, the backups are taken to a special room, where the second numbers are required to pass a glass of pure alcohol with some specialists preparing the spacecraft for flight. It is more difficult for the main crew. The cosmonauts, who in a few days will face colossal overloads and weightlessness, are only allowed to sip champagne on the morning of the launch day, immediately after ascent. But the doubles have to raise their glasses again after the astronauts going on a flight take their places in the cockpit of the spacecraft. The founders of this tradition, which has been going on for more than 12 years, were 3 journalists: Georgy Loria, own correspondent of the Kazakh youth team, Leninskaya Smina, Yaroslav Nechesa, head of the Cosmodrome Press Center, and the author of these lines, who at that time worked as a correspondent for the Baikonur newspaper. It happened like this. In March 1992, it was very cold at the observation post, where all the guests who came to watch the launch of the spacecraft are accommodated. Everyone warmed up, including the press, in the buffet. And suddenly doubles came in, Anatoly Solovyov and Sergei Aviv. Recognizing the journalists, who literally tortured them with their questions the day before, Anatoly and Sergei approached us. We, of course, invited them to warm up. To our great surprise, the astronauts did not refuse. They just said that the toast would be short, for good luck. After drinking 50 grams each, the understudies left. Georgy Luria for some reason looked at his watch and said, "Guys, half an hour is left before the start." The Soyuz TM-14 flight, which launched Viktorinov, Kaleri and Flade, went off without a hitch. Before the next flight, we again proposed to the backup crew to raise a toast, for good luck with the appropriate explanations. They also remembered the half-hour readiness. The flight was successful again. Moreover, this time a crew consisting of cosmonauts Solovyov and Aviv went into orbit. Their flight and work at the Mir station went off without a hitch. And since then, a small impromptu journalists has become a real pre-launch tradition. Only a few times the understudies did not take part in this tradition. For the first time, the Frenchwoman Claudie Andrade, who was supposed to go into space on the next ship, refused to follow the tradition. But instead of her, her future husband Jean-Pierre Enere was the first to fly into space. And Claudie herself went into space only after us, took on the chest, for half an hour readiness in the company of journalists. Another incident happened to our very good friend Gennady Manikov. Gennady Mikhailovich, together with his flight engineer Pavel Vinogradov, duplicated the main crew of the Soyuz TM-23 spacecraft in 1996 and simply forgot to come to the traditional half-hour. And 15 days before leaving for Baikonur next summer, Gennady Manikov had to end his space career for medical reasons. And instead of the crew of Manikov Vinogradov, Valery Korzun and Alexander Kaleri went into space. Gennady Mikhailovich, together with his flight engineer Pavel Vinogradov, duplicated the main crew of the Soyuz TM-23 spacecraft in 1996 and simply forgot to come to the traditional half-hour. And 15 days before leaving for Baikonur next summer, Gennady Manikov had to end his space career for medical reasons. And instead of the crew of Manikov Vinogradov, Valery Korzun and Alexander Kaleri went into space. Gennady Mikhailovich, together with his flight engineer Pavel Vinogradov, duplicated the main crew of the Soyuz TM-23 spacecraft in 1996 and simply forgot to come to the traditional half-hour. And 15 days before leaving for Baikonur next summer, Gennady Manikov had to end his space career for medical reasons. And instead of the crew of Manikov Vinogradov, Valery Korzun and Alexander Kaleri went into space. Today, even astronaut candidates know about this tradition. And, if at first only understudies took part in the tradition of raising the symbolic 50 grams, for good luck, then over time other cosmonauts who were at Baikonur at that time began to join them. Including foreign astronauts. In the city of Baikonur itself, the main unwritten tradition is the annual opening of monuments, squares and new social and cultural facilities on the city day. And the awarding of the title, Honorary Resident of the City of Baikonur. Fortunately, there are a lot of worthy famous people who have devoted their lives to the conquest of outer space and linked their fate with Baikonur in the space harbor. And the grateful people of Baikonur honor their memory. Everything has changed so much for the better that Baikonur residents never dreamed of before. Two flags, Russian and Kazakh, flying over the city administration today remind that Baikonur, leased by Kazakhstan to the Russian Federation, is a unique phenomenon on a global scale. Only here, under a special agreement, there are 2 police departments, 2 state traffic inspectorates, 2 courts and 3 prosecutors' offices, taking into account the military supervisory authority, 2 military registration and enlistment offices, and 2 registry offices. Moreover, you can buy any product or service at Baikonur both for Russian rubles and for Kazakhstani tenge. These 2 currencies officially go here. And all this in order to respect the constitutional rights of citizens of Russia and Kazakhstan. And all issues related to ensuring the life of the entire space complex are regulated by a special intergovernmental commission on the Baikonur complex. Today the city of Baikonur is a cozy settlement with a population of 70,000, with clean green streets and avenues, with modern infrastructure and cheerful people. A significant improvement in urban life is evidenced by the fact that for more than 5 years Baikonur residents have not known problems with cold and hot water, gas, electricity, and heating. Well, when it is warm and cozy in the apartments, you want your hometown to look beautiful and well-groomed. And the city authorities do not spare money for the improvement of Baikonur. In the city of Baikonur, there are practically no wastelands left, most of them have been turned into squares and parks. Or built up with modern complexes. For example, the fashionable 4-star Sputnik hotel, built on a former wasteland specifically for the residence of foreign specialists. The current flourishing of the city of Baikonur is also indicated by the increase in the birth rate of children in the space harbor. Although in 2003 a full-fledged maternity ward for 40 beds was also opened in the city polyclinic, this is no longer enough because even residents of the nearest regional centers come here to give birth. Therefore, today the city authorities, together with the Kazakh side, are planning the construction of a separate maternity hospital. Baikonur has long been independently training highly qualified specialists in the space industry. And not only for myself. The Voskhod Baikonur branch of the Moscow Aviation Institute, which recently celebrated its 40th anniversary, has been producing space specialists for the Republic of Kazakhstan under a special agreement between the governments of Russia and Kazakhstan for 10 years. At the end of the 90s of the last century, several more branches of Russian and Kazakh universities were opened in the city. A lot of specialists for the Cosmodrome are being trained by the Baikonur Electro-Radio Technical School. In addition, a vocational school and a medical school operate in the city. Even the system of secondary education is unique in the city of Baikonur. Here, Russian city authorities pay for education in schools and gymnasiums for both Russians and Kazakhs. Moreover, out of 10 secondary schools in 4, instruction is provided in the Kazakh language. Of the 4 primary schools, 2 also teach in Kazakh. And only in Baikonur is the only international space school in the CIS, which was established in the early 90s of the 20th century on the initiative of the President of Kazakhstan Nursultan Nazarbayev. The uniqueness of the International Space School is not only in the fact that here they study in depth the disciplines necessary for future space explorers. And the fact is that every year in April-May, several leading Russian universities send their admission examination boards here on purpose. And those graduate students who successfully pass the entrance exams become students. Moreover, even before the final exams at the space school itself. Finally, the issue of providing passenger transport has also been resolved. Dozens of shuttle buses run around the city and to the station. And a lot of private taxis. True, a taxi in Baikonur is distinguished by its peculiarity. Here they take a fare from each passenger. It doesn't matter if it's the same family. You have to pay for each one separately. There is no difference that you are traveling alone in 2 taxis, or 2 in 1. Therefore, such a joke is very popular in Baikonur. Some Baikonur residents, when they go to the same place together, take 2 separate taxis from the parking lot and taxi up to the right address with style. The residents of Baikonur hold a wide variety of sports in high esteem. This has been the case since the foundation of the Cosmodrome. In the 60s and 70s of the last century, the football and handball teams of the Space Harbour played in the professional championships of the USSR. And sports life in Baikonur has never stopped. It is not surprising that in the city of 70,000 today, there are 18 federations of various sports and 2 sports clubs. Football and volleyball grounds in Baikonur are simply innumerable. And in terms of the number of competitions held annually, the Space Berth can compete with many regional centers in Russia and Kazakhstan. Moreover, Baikonur hosts competitions of such a level as the stages of the World Cup in ballroom dancing and rocket modeling sports. And for serious sports, there is a large sports and recreation complex, which includes a 50-meter swimming pool, which, by the way, became the second such facility built in Soviet times in Kazakhstan, tennis courts, a stadium, a sports complex with gyms and games rooms. And most importantly, great attention is paid to the development of children's sports. And they do not distinguish by citizenship, both Russians and Kazakhstanis are included in the Baikonur teams. The result of such a policy is that Baikonur athletes become winners and prize winners at the highest level competitions in Russia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Uzbekistan. And even European and World Championships. Special respect of Baikonur sports fans is caused by winter mini-football tournaments on snow, which have been held since the beginning of the 80s of the last century. Since then, not only has there not been a single disruption of the tournament, not even a single match has been postponed, even in the most severe frosts. In Soviet times, Baikonur residents were quite often spoiled with celebrity concerts. Suffice it to say that Alla Pugacheva, Valery Leontiev, the ensembles, Gems, Flame, and many other stars came to the Space Harbour on tour. Moreover, in one of the concerts on the Baikonur stage, the future stars of humor Gennady Kazanov and Vladimir Vinica made their debut as an entertainer. Few even in Baikonur know, but in the late 80s, the legendary Pink Floyd group came to the Cosmodrome for a couple of days. Unfortunately, they did not come on tour, but in order to shoot their video. Therefore, the arrival of famous musicians was not particularly advertised. By the way, the cultural life of Baikonur did not stop even in the dark years. Even despite the fact that in the winter of 1994 the House of Officers burned down and the House of Culture of Builders was unfrozen. Circles and studios of the House of Officers moved to the neighboring building of the former women's hostel. And where before the girls sighed languidly for their suitors, beautiful music began to sound. The almost empty cinema, Saturn, was transformed into a modern cinema and concert complex. The former House of Culture of the Builders was turned into a real city palace of culture. Today, more than 100 different circles work in the GDK, the Garrison House of Officers and the Center for Children and Youth Creativity. 2 children's music schools provide a decent education for young talents from Baikonur. Every year, the city hosts several festivals in the city to identify talents. There are various competitions and even carnivals. And Baikonur is a member of the International Association of Carnival Cities. And its delegations take part in many carnival events in other cities. By the way, numerous concerts dedicated to city holidays at Baikonur are prepared by local artists and are invariably held to a storm of applause from grateful spectators. However, even today Baikonur is not deprived of concerts of famous artists. Pop stars of the first magnitude both from Russia and Kazakhstan come here with concerts. Theatre groups also tour. What else Baikonur residents can boast of is that even without leaving the city, its residents can directly come into contact with astronautics. Numerous memorable places, real rockets on pedestals, walls of high-rise buildings painted by artists on space themes, the Museum of Cosmonautics, everything reminds of the space status of the administrative center of the Cosmodrome. And the closest place to space in the city of Baikonur is the Cosmonaut Hotel, on the territory of which cosmonauts spend their final days before flying into near-Earth orbit. And from here the crews are escorted to the start. And in conclusion, I will say a little more. Let it be instead of an epilogue. Baikonur has experienced both ups and downs in its more than 50-year history. It was even on the verge of extinction, but survived. And he even became the initiator of a new direction in astronautics. Since 2001, space tourists began to fly to the stars from here. But the most important thing for all Baikonur residents is that spaceships continue to launch into the starry sky from the Baikonur Cosmodrome. This book was published thanks to the financial support of my longtime friend, businessman and philanthropist Viktor Nikitin. At the beginning of the 21st century, when I was still working on the local Baikonur television channel Visa 2, Viktor Anatolievich sponsored my weekly program Over a Cup of Coffee with Oleg Akhmetov for several years. Moreover, the program was recorded in his famous hunting lodge cafe throughout the Cosmodrome. Then, Viktor Anatolievich provided me with financial support in making a film about the city of Baikonur called The Capital of the Cosmodrome. And when I had a desire to write my own book about the space harbor, Viktor Nikitin promised that he would take care of all the printing costs. And as you can see, he kept his word. I hope this is not our last joint project.